The doctor looked me dead in the eye and handed down a sentence that shattered my entire world. He told me I was completely infertile. My fiancé did not hold me or wipe away my tears. Instead, he ripped his hand away from mine like I carried a deadly disease. He looked down at me with pure disgust, called me a useless dead branch, and walked right out of the clinic door. 9 months later, he sent me a gold foil invitation to his luxury wedding just to humiliate me in front of high society. But he nearly collapsed when I crashed that reception uninvited and showed everyone what kind of man he truly was. I am Simone, 32 years old, and a commercial real estate developer based in Atlanta. If you have ever been discarded like trash by the person you loved most, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is massive success. We were sitting in a private suite at a high-end fertility clinic in Buckhead. The room did not feel like a hospital. It felt like a luxury hotel lobby with plush velvet chairs, mahogany tables, and soft ambient lighting designed to keep wealthy clients calm. I sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, gripping my leather purse so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My fiancé Julian sat next to me. Julian was 34 years old and the vice president of an elite wealth management fund. He was dressed impeccably in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, checking his expensive watch every 2 minutes. He hated waiting. Julian belonged to one of the most prominent African-American families in Atlanta. His family pedigree was everything to him. They were legacy members of exclusive social clubs and proud alumni of prestigious universities. I had always known that marrying into his family meant carrying the weight of their immense expectations. For the past year, we had been trying to start our family. Every month brought a new wave of hope followed by crushing disappointment. The negative pregnancy tests piled up in our bathroom trash can, taking a heavy toll on my spirit. Julian grew increasingly frustrated. He treated conception like a business acquisition that was failing to yield a return on investment. That was why we were at this specific clinic today. Dr. Sterling was a renowned specialist tightly connected to Julian's influential family circle. I had undergone weeks of invasive testing, blood work, and painful ultrasounds. Today we were finally getting the results. I reached out and placed my hand over Julian's hand, seeking comfort. His skin felt cold. He did not interlock his fingers with mine. He just stared blankly at the frosted glass door of the office. The heavy wooden door finally swung open, and Dr. Sterling walked in, holding a thick manila folder. He did not have the warm, reassuring smile he usually wore at charity galas. His face was entirely unreadable. A heavy silence filled the luxurious room, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to hear that everything was fine. I wanted a simple prescription or a minor procedure that would fix whatever small issue was delaying our dreams. Dr. Sterling sat down in the leather chair across from us and opened the file. He took a long, slow breath before looking directly into my eyes. "Simone," he started, his voice quiet and clinical. "We have reviewed all of your hormone panels and ultrasound imaging extensively. I am so sorry to tell you this, but the results are conclusive. You have a condition called premature ovarian failure." The words hovered in the air, making absolutely no sense to my brain. I blinked, staring at the doctor, trying to process the syllables. Premature ovarian failure. I repeated the phrase out loud, tasting how bitter and clinical it sounded. What does that mean exactly? Is there a medication I can take? Can we do in vitro fertilization? Dr. Sterling closed the folder and folded his hands on the desk. He looked at Julian first and then back at me. "Simone, your ovarian reserve is completely depleted. The condition is irreversible. You do not have any viable eggs left. I am telling you that you are 100% infertile. You will never be able to conceive or carry a biological child." The room started to spin. The soft ambient lighting suddenly felt blindingly bright. A high-pitched ringing sound filled my ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the clinic. "Never." The word echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my skull. I was only 32 years old. I had spent my entire 20s building a commercial real estate business from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks to secure my financial independence. I had delayed starting a family, because I wanted to provide a perfect, stable life for my future children. Now a man in a white coat was telling me that my future children did not exist. They would never exist. A sharp sob tore its way out of my throat. I turned to Julian, desperately needing him to pull me into his arms. I needed him to tell me that we would figure it out together. I needed him to say that my worth as his future wife was not tied solely to my ability to reproduce. I needed to know that our love was stronger than a medical diagnosis. Instead of pulling me close, Julian did the exact opposite. He physically recoiled from me. He ripped his hand out from under mine so fast that my fingers slipped off his knee. The look on his face was something I will never forget for as long as I live. It was not grief. It was not sorrow. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at me as if I had just confessed to a terrible crime, as if I had intentionally deceived him. "Julian, what is wrong?" I whispered, reaching out for him again. My vision was completely blurred by tears. "Please talk to me. We can look into adoption. We can look into surrogacy. There are other ways to build a family." Julian stood up abruptly, pushing his velvet chair back with such force that the wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his collar with stiff, robotic movements. He looked down at me sitting, crumpled and crying on the sofa. His eyes were completely devoid of any warmth or affection. The man who had proposed to me under a canopy of stars just 6 months ago was gone. In his place stood a cold, calculating stranger who only cared about social currency. "Adoption," he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think my family is going to accept some random child into our bloodline? You think I am going to pass down my wealth and my name to a stranger just because your body is broken?" I gasped, clutching my chest. The pain of his words was worse than the medical diagnosis. "Julian, you cannot mean that," I cried. "We love each other. We built a life together. We share a home." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Love does not secure a legacy, Simone." He turned to Dr. Sterling, completely ignoring my sobbing. "Thank you for your time, doctor. I appreciate you being direct with us. Please send the final consultation bill to my office manager." Dr. Sterling looked slightly uncomfortable, but he nodded, keeping his professional distance. Julian turned back to me one last time. He looked me up and down, analyzing me like a piece of commercial real estate that had just failed a major inspection. "My mother was right about you," he stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "She always said I should have chosen someone from our own circles. Someone properly vetted. I lowered my standards for you because I thought you were at least healthy enough to bear my children. But you cannot even do the one basic biological task a woman is supposed to do. My family legacy cannot end with a dead branch." He turned on his heel and walked straight toward the heavy wooden door. "Julian, wait!" I screamed, stumbling to my feet. My knees felt weak and I nearly fell back onto the sofa. "Please do not walk out on me right now. I am begging you. Do not leave me here alone." He paused with his hand on the brass door handle. He did not look back over his shoulder. He did not offer a single word of comfort. "I will have my assistant cancel the wedding venue tomorrow," he said coldly. "Do not call my phone." The heavy door clicked shut behind him, echoing with a finality that shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I collapsed back onto the sofa, burying my face in my hands as the full weight of the tragedy crashed down on me. I had just lost my dream of becoming a mother, and the man I thought was my soulmate, all within the span of 10 agonizing minutes. I was completely, utterly alone in that sterile luxury clinic, weeping until I could barely breathe. I had no idea that this devastating heartbreak was merely the opening scene of a much darker, twisted nightmare, orchestrated by the very people I had trusted with my life. Dr. Sterling offered me a box of tissues, but he remained behind his large mahogany desk. He did not offer any words of comfort or professional sympathy. He just watched me cry with a detached clinical gaze that made me feel entirely exposed. I wiped my face, trying to gather whatever tiny shred of dignity I had left. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped my phone twice, trying to put it back into my leather purse. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, making it incredibly hard to draw a complete breath. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like lead. I did not look back at the doctor as I walked out of the suite and into the long, quiet hallway of the clinic. The walk to the elevator felt like a death march. Other wealthy couples sat in the waiting room holding hands and whispering excitedly about their future families. I kept my head down, hiding my tear-stained cheeks and swollen eyes from their curious glances. When the elevator doors finally closed, shielding me from the world, I leaned against the cold metal wall and let out a broken, agonizing wail. I had spent my entire adult life fighting for a seat at the table, breaking through barriers in the commercial real estate world, proving that a woman from a normal middle-class background could achieve greatness. I had conquered every obstacle placed in my path, but this was a battle I could not win with hard work or sheer determination. My own body had betrayed me in the cruelest way possible, and Julian had thrown me away the exact second I stopped being useful to his grand vision of a perfect high society dynasty. As I walked out into the bright Atlanta sunlight, the heavy, humid air wrapping around me, I knew my life would never be the same again. The future I had meticulously planned with Julian had burned to the ground, leaving nothing but toxic smoke and ashes. The first layer of betrayal had been executed with ruthless precision. I walked toward my car feeling empty and broken, completely unaware of the brutal ambush waiting for me back at the penthouse we shared. The nightmare was truly just beginning to unfold before my eyes. I drove back to our luxury penthouse in a complete daze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, but my mind was completely numb. I kept telling myself that Julian just panicked. Men panic. The diagnosis was a shock to both of us. Surely once he had time to process the news, he would realize that our relationship was worth more than his mother's obsession with a legacy. We had built a life together. We shared a home. The penthouse was located in one of the most exclusive high-rise buildings in Buckhead. It was a stunning property, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. It was also a property that I had essentially bought for us. When we found the place, Julian claimed his liquid assets were temporarily tied up in his investment funds. Because I loved him and trusted him implicitly, I had wired $200,000 of my own hard-earned savings for the down payment. Julian had convinced me to put the deed solely in his name, claiming it made sense for tax purposes and wealth management planning. I was so blinded by love and the promise of our impending marriage that I signed the paperwork without a second thought. I believed what was his was mine. I parked in the underground garage and took the private elevator up to the top floor. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs. I rehearsed what I was going to say. I would be calm. I would tell him that we could seek a second opinion. I would remind him of all the promises we made to each other. The elevator doors chimed and slid open directly into our foyer. The moment I stepped inside, the illusion of a reconciliation shattered completely. Julian was not pacing the floor in regret. He was not pouring a drink to calm his nerves. He was standing rigidly by the marble kitchen island, his arms crossed over his chest, and he was not alone. Sitting in the center of my custom white Italian leather sofa was Beatrice. She was Julian's mother and the undisputed matriarch of Atlanta elite high society. Beatrice was 62 years old, but carried herself with the terrifying poise of a queen inspecting her subjects. She sat on the boards of half the museums in the city and treated the local Jack and Jill chapters like her personal kingdom. Today she was wearing a flawless pearl-white suit, her hair impeccably styled, not a single strand out of place. She held a crystal glass of sparkling water. She did not look up when I walked in. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip from her glass. The air in the penthouse was freezing. Julian must have turned the air conditioning down to match the temperature of the room. Julian. I started, my voice trembling as I dropped my keys onto the console table. Why is your mother here? We need to talk. We need to figure this out alone. Beatrice finally turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were sharp and devoid of any human empathy. She set her glass down on the glass coffee table with a sharp clink. There is nothing left to figure out, Simone, she announced. Her tone was sharp and commanding, cutting through the quiet room like a blade. The situation has been assessed, and the conclusion is final. You will not be marrying my son. I stared at her, feeling the blood drain from my face. I looked over at Julian, pleading silently for him to intervene, to tell his mother she was overstepping. Julian just stared at the floor, avoiding my eyes entirely. Julian, I whispered, taking a step toward the kitchen. Please tell me this is a joke. Tell me you did not run straight to your mother to call off our wedding just hours after my diagnosis. He finally looked up, his expression completely hardened. It is not a joke, Simone. My mother is right. I have a duty to my family name. I have a duty to the legacy my grandfather built. I cannot fulfill that duty with a woman who is medically defective. The words hit me like physical blows to the chest. Medically defective. He spoke about me as if I were a piece of broken machinery that needed to be sent to the scrapyard. Beatrice stood up, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her pristine white skirt. She walked slowly toward me, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stopped just a few feet away, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "Let us dispense with the emotional theatrics," Simone Beatrice said coldly. "You are a smart girl in your own little way. You know how our world works. A woman who cannot provide an heir to this family is a useless woman, a dead branch on a very important family tree. We cannot afford dead branches." I felt a hot flash of anger burning through my grief. "I am not a dead branch," I shot back, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and devastation. "I am a successful woman who loves your son. I built my own company. I paid the down payment on this very apartment." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She glanced at Julian as if I had just told a hilarious joke. "Oh yes, your little real estate projects. Do not insult my intelligence, Simone. You come from a painfully ordinary middle-class background. Public schools. No notable lineage. No legacy to speak of. We only tolerated your presence in my son's life because you were driven, and we assumed you possessed good breeding hips. We thought you would at least be capable of producing strong heirs to carry the family name forward. Now that we know your body is barren, your presence here is completely obsolete." I gasped, stepping back as if she had slapped me across the face. The sheer cruelty of her words was paralyzing. She was stripping away my humanity, reducing my entire worth to my reproductive organs. "Take off the ring," Beatrice commanded, holding out her perfectly manicured hand. I looked down at my left hand. The 3-carat emerald-cut diamond caught the afternoon light, sparkling brilliantly. Julian had placed it on my finger 6 months ago, promising me forever. Now his mother was demanding it back like a confiscated toy. I looked at Julian again, hoping against hope that he would finally stand up and be a man. "Julian, are you going to let her do this? Are you going to let her speak to me this way? I love you. We are supposed to be a team." Julian uncrossed his arms and walked over to stand right beside his mother. They looked like a united, impenetrable front of cruelty. "Take off the ring," Simone Julian said, his voice flat and emotionless. "It is a family heirloom. It belongs to a future mother of this family. It does not belong to you anymore." My fingers trembled violently as I reached for the diamond. It felt heavy suddenly, like a shackle I had been blind to. I pulled the ring over my knuckle. I did not place it gently into Beatrice's waiting palm. I threw it directly at Julian's chest. The heavy ring bounced off his tailored suit jacket and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "You are both monsters," I sobbed, the tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. "You are hollow, soulless monsters. I pity the woman who actually ends up giving this family an heir because you will destroy her soul, just like you are trying to destroy mine." Beatrice did not even flinch. She simply bent down, picked up the diamond ring, and dropped it into her designer handbag. She looked at Julian, giving him a crisp nod of approval. He had passed her test. He had successfully discarded the broken liability. "You have exactly 2 hours to pack your bags and get out of my penthouse," Julian stated, checking his watch with that same impatient gesture he had used at the clinic. "I expect you to be completely gone before I return from my dinner meeting tonight." "Your penthouse," I screamed, my anger finally boiling over. "I gave you $200,000 for this place, Julian. This is my home. You cannot just throw me out on the street with 2 hours' notice." Julian smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that made my blood run absolutely cold. "Check the deed, Simone. My name is the only name on that document. Legally, this property belongs entirely to me. You are nothing but an uninvited guest who has overstayed her welcome. If you are not gone in 2 hours, my building security team will physically remove you and your belongings from the premises." He turned his back on me and walked to the front door, holding it open for his mother. Beatrice paused in this doorway, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Do try to exit quietly," Simone Beatrice instructed without looking back. Do not make a scene in the lobby. We have a reputation to maintain, and it would be a shame to have you arrested for trespassing." The heavy door slammed shut behind them, locking me inside a luxury prison I had paid for. I was entirely alone. My legs gave out and I sank onto the cold hardwood floor, hugging my knees to my chest. The reality of the ambush hit me with the force of a freight train. They had not just broken my heart. They had systematically stripped me of my dignity, my future, and my financial security in a single afternoon. I had 2 hours to pack up my entire life into a few suitcases, 2 hours to mourn the death of the future I had envisioned. I pulled myself off the floor, my vision blurred with tears, but a new, unfamiliar emotion began to burn in the pit of my stomach. It was not just sorrow anymore. It was the spark of absolute searing rage. I dragged my suitcases out of the master closet and began throwing my clothes into them, wiping my tears away with the back of my hand. I moved through the penthouse like a ghost haunting my own life. I grabbed my blazers, my shoes, my jewelry box, leaving behind anything Julian had ever purchased for me. I wanted nothing that carried the stench of his money or his family's toxic legacy. As I zipped up the second suitcase, I looked around the beautiful living room I had meticulously decorated. The custom artwork I had commissioned, the silk drapes I had chosen, the life I had poured my heart into building. It was all a lie. The man I loved was a coward who hid behind his mother's skirts. The family I wanted to join was a venomous snake pit that only valued women as breeding cattle. I dragged the heavy suitcases to the front door, pausing to look at my reflection in the hallway mirror. My eyes were red and swollen, my face pale and streaked with mascara. I looked broken. But beneath the heartbreak, a silent promise solidified in my mind. I would not let them win. I would rebuild my life brick by brick, and I would make sure they eventually paid for every single tear I was shedding today. I grabbed the door handle, stepping out into the hallway and leaving my old life behind forever. 3 days passed in a blur of hotel room service and meetings with my lawyers. I had not shed a single tear since the elevator doors closed behind me on that first day. My sadness had completely calcified into a cold, hard shell of determination. I was returning to the Buckhead penthouse today. I had left with only 2 suitcases containing my clothes, but I had invested thousands of dollars into the custom furniture and imported artwork that filled that apartment. I was not going to let Julian keep the spoils of my hard work. I hired a professional moving crew, instructed them to wait in the service hallway, and took the private elevator up to the top floor with my spare key tight in my hand. Julian had demanded I leave, but he had not formally evicted me, and he certainly had not managed to change the biometric locks yet. I pressed my thumb to the scanner and heard the heavy deadbolt click open. I expected the penthouse to be empty. Julian always played golf on Saturday mornings, and his mother usually spent her weekends terrorizing the board members of the local country club. I pushed the door open, stepping into the expansive foyer. Instead of silence, I was greeted by the sound of bright, tinkling laughter echoing from the open concept kitchen. It was not Julian's laugh. It was a high-pitched melodic sound that grated against my ears immediately. I froze, signaling for the 2 large men from the moving crew to wait out in the hall. I walked slowly down the hallway, my heels sinking silently into the plush runner rug. As I rounded the corner into the main living area, the scene laid out before me made my blood run absolutely cold. There, standing in the center of the sunlit kitchen, was Valerie. She was 28 years old, the self-proclaimed heiress to a massive southern logistics empire. And the woman, Beatrice, had always subtly shoved in Julian's direction at high society galas. Valerie was leaning against the marble island, holding a crystal champagne flute filled with orange juice and champagne. But it was not the mimosa in her hand that made my stomach churn. It was what she was wearing. Valerie was draped in my custom-made emerald green silk robe, the very same robe I had ordered from a boutique in Milan for my honeymoon. She had it tied loosely around her waist, looking entirely too comfortable in a home I had paid the massive down payment for. Julian was standing right beside her, pouring a fresh bottle of vintage champagne. And sitting on a bar stool, looking like a victorious general observing a conquered territory, was Beatrice. "Well, look who finally learned how to use the service elevator," Valerie chirped. She took a slow sip of her mimosa, her eyes raking over my practical jeans and blazer. She did not look embarrassed in the slightest. She looked incredibly smug. Julian flinched, spilling a few drops of champagne on the expensive marble counter. He quickly set the bottle down, his face flushing with a mix of shock and extreme irritation. "Simone, what are you doing here?" he snapped, taking a step forward. "I told you to be gone by Tuesday. You are trespassing in my home." "I am not trespassing, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I came to collect the custom dining table, the imported rugs, and the modern art pieces that I purchased with my own money. I have the receipts, and I have a moving crew waiting in the hallway. But please do continue your little morning celebration. Do not let me interrupt." Beatrice let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She swirled the champagne in her glass and gave me a look of pure pity mingled with absolute contempt. "You really have no sense of timing, Simone. But since you decided to crash a private family moment, you might as well stay for the toast. It is only fitting that you see what a proper match looks like for a man of Julian's stature." Beatrice stood up and raised her crystal glass high in the air. Julian wrapped his arm tightly around Valerie's waist, pulling her close against his side. Valerie rested her free hand dramatically on her flat stomach, offering me a sickeningly sweet smile that made my hands curl into fists. To Valerie, Beatrice announced, her voice projecting loudly across the penthouse. "To the beautiful, accomplished woman who is bringing true joy to this family, I am thrilled to officially toast to my future daughter-in-law and to the golden bloodline she is carrying. 4 weeks pregnant and already giving this family exactly what it deserves. A perfect, healthy heir to continue our legacy." The crystal glasses clinked together, producing a sharp, ringing sound that seemed to slice right through my brain. 4 weeks pregnant. The words echoed in my head over and over again. I stared at Valerie's hand resting protectively on her stomach, and then looked up at Julian's smug face. I did the mental math instantly. 4 weeks. My appointment at the fertility clinic had only been 3 days ago. If Valerie was already 4 weeks pregnant, that meant Julian had been sleeping with her for at least a month. He had been intimately entangled with this logistics heiress while I was undergoing painful hormone injections and invasive ultrasounds. He had been building a future with her while sitting across the dinner table from me, planning a wedding he never intended to actually attend. The realization hit me with the force of an earthquake. The infertility diagnosis at the clinic was not the tragic breaking point of our relationship. It was their highly convenient excuse. Julian and Beatrice had orchestrated this entire transition long before I ever stepped foot in that medical office. They needed a solid reason to discard me without Julian looking like a villain to his elite peers. What better way to dump a loyal fiancé than to blame it on her biological failure to provide an heir? They used my deepest vulnerability as a weapon to execute their selfish agenda and make room for Valerie. "You were sleeping with her," I said. My voice did not shake. It dropped an octave, settling into a cold, hard register. "You were sleeping with her for weeks, Julian." Julian stiffened his posture, going completely rigid. "Do not try to make this about me, Simone. You are the one who kept your medical deficiencies a secret. You are the one who tried to trap me into a childless marriage to secure my wealth. Valerie stepped in when I needed emotional support. She provided exactly what you could not give me." Valerie let out a soft, arrogant laugh and adjusted the collar of my silk robe. "Julian deserves a woman who can actually fulfill her duties," she purred, stepping closer to him. "You should be apologizing to him for wasting his valuable time. But do not worry, I will take excellent care of him and our baby. You can just quietly pack up your little things and go back to whatever public school neighborhood you came from." I looked at the three of them, standing united in their cruelty and arrogance. Beatrice was smiling, a cold, victorious smile. She had finally gotten exactly what she wanted. She had ousted the middle-class outsider and secured a wealthy, well-connected heiress to incubate her precious legacy. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of absolute clarity wash over me. The grief that had been choking me for 3 days vanished completely. It evaporated into thin air, replaced by a sharp, hyper-focused energy. I was not looking at a family I had lost. I was looking at a massive bullet I had narrowly dodged. "You are absolutely right, Valerie," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step into the kitchen. "Julian deserves exactly the kind of woman you are, and you deserve exactly the kind of man he is." A weak coward who hides behind his mother's bank account and uses lies to get out of difficult situations. You two are a match made in high society heaven. I turned to Beatrice, who had suddenly stopped smiling. Keep the engagement ring, Beatrice. Consider it a parting gift. You are going to need all the extra jewelry you can find to distract people from the rotting core of your family. How dare you speak to us this way? Beatrice hissed, slamming her glass down on the marble counter. You are nothing. You are a barren nobody who tried to climb the social ladder and failed miserably. Get your trash out of my son's home before I call the police and have you arrested. I turned my back on them and walked to the front door. I signaled the two large men from the moving crew who were waiting patiently in the hall. Gentlemen, I said, gesturing broadly to the living room. Please take the 12-seater mahogany dining table, the abstract paintings in the hall, and the two imported rugs. Leave the sofa. It has already been ruined by cheap company. Julian stepped forward, his face red with sudden anger. You cannot just take the furniture, Simone. I have important guests coming over tomorrow evening. I pulled the stack of purchase receipts from my blazer pocket and waved them in the air. Unless you want to reimburse me, the $45,000 I spent decorating your empty white box. Julian, these items are leaving with me today. You can have your new heiress buy you a replacement table. I am sure her logistics empire can ship one overnight. I walked directly into the master bedroom while the movers began disassembling the heavy dining table. I did not bother looking at the bed we used to share. I went straight to the master closet and grabbed the few remaining items of mine. As I was walking out, I noticed my custom emerald green silk robe hanging on the back of the bathroom door. I stopped and realized that was my backup robe. The one Valerie was wearing was the primary one. The sheer audacity of her going through my personal wardrobe and putting on my intimate clothing made my skin crawl, but it also solidified my absolute resolve. They had no boundaries and they had no shame. I walked back into the living area where Julian was angrily watching the movers roll up a massive Persian rug. Valerie had retreated to the far corner of the kitchen, looking incredibly annoyed that her victory celebration was being interrupted by manual labor. Beatrice was furiously texting someone on her phone, likely complaining to her country club friends about my utter lack of decorum. When the last painting was taken off the wall, the penthouse looked bare and echoey. It looked exactly like what it truly was, an empty, hollow shell. I stood in the doorway looking at the three of them one last time. I did not feel sad. I did not feel broken. I felt a tremendous sense of liberation. Enjoy the empty apartment, Julian, I said, my voice carrying easily across the barren room. And Valerie, I advise you to wash that silk robe on high heat. I wore it when I had the flu last month and sweated through it for 3 days. Valerie's face contorted in absolute horror, and she immediately began struggling to untie the silk belt. Julian opened his mouth to shout something, but I did not stick around to hear his pathetic defense. I stepped out into the hallway and let the heavy door slam shut behind me, severing my connection to Julian and his toxic family once and for all. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, a fierce new energy pulsing through my veins. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought they had discarded me neatly and cleanly, using a fabricated medical tragedy to mask their own despicable betrayal. They assumed I would just crawl into a hole and disappear in shame, allowing them to control the narrative. But Beatrice and Julian had made a critical miscalculation. They had underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I was not a fragile socialite who relied on family money to survive. I was a self-made woman who knew how to build empires from scratch. I walked out of that luxury high-rise and into the bright Atlanta sun, ready to go to war. I was going to secure my business, protect my assets, and uncover every single dirty secret that family was hiding. The battle lines were drawn, and I was preparing to burn their entire legacy to the ground. Section 4, send 500 words. I threw myself entirely into my work. My commercial real estate firm was my actual baby. I had spent the last 4 years acquiring permits, drafting plans, and securing zoning approvals for a massive downtown revitalization project. It was a multi-million-dollar development aimed at transforming an abandoned warehouse district into a thriving hub of luxury lofts and boutique spaces. It was the kind of project that would cement my name in the Atlanta real estate industry. I needed this project to succeed now more than ever. It was my lifeboat. If Julian and his mother thought I was going to curl up in a ball and cry over a lost relationship, they were severely mistaken. I channeled every ounce of my rage into productivity, working 18-hour days fueled by black coffee and sheer spite. I finalized blueprints and prepared for the final round of investor meetings to break ground. But I had severely underestimated the sheer reach of Beatrice's venom. She wanted to make sure that Julian leaving me looked like a lucky escape for their family, rather than a cruel betrayal. To do that, she needed to destroy my credibility completely. Beatrice wielded her social capital like a loaded weapon. She was a cornerstone of the Atlanta Black elite, sitting on the boards of the most prestigious charities and holding massive sway over the local historically Black college alumni networks. Her influence bled into the exclusive Buckhead country clubs and the tight-knit elite society chapters. These were the very networks I relied on for funding and political support for my development projects. The sabotage started as a subtle freezing out. I would walk into a charity luncheon or a Chamber of Commerce networking event, and the room would noticeably chill. Women who used to greet me with air kisses suddenly found reasons to look the other way. Men who had previously been eager to discuss real estate investments suddenly remembered urgent phone calls they had to take the second I approached them. Hushed conversations behind manicured hands abruptly stopped the moment I walked past. I told myself it was just awkwardness over the canceled wedding. But the freezing out quickly escalated into outright hostility. My calls to city council members who had previously championed my project were sent straight to voicemail. Emails to zoning officials went unanswered. Gift baskets sent to potential investors were returned to my office unopened. The invisible walls of Atlanta high society were rapidly closing in around me. It took a week for the actual rumors to reach my ears. They were delivered by Marcus, a local architect and a good friend. He came to my office late one evening looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Simone, you need to know what they are saying about you out there," he said, his voice low. "Beatrice hosted a private dinner party for the hospital board last weekend. She told everyone that Julian called off the wedding because he discovered you were secretly barren. She told them you hid your medical condition from him to trap him into marriage." I felt a hot flush of humiliation burn my cheeks. Beatrice had weaponized my barrenness, using my deepest trauma as a scandalous appetizer for her wealthy friends. But the character assassination did not stop there. "That is not even the worst part, Marcus continued, shifting uncomfortably. "Beatrice is telling the major investment groups that you are a thief. She is claiming that you embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from Julian's private wealth management fund to finance your real estate company. She told everyone that Julian caught you stealing and kicked you out of the penthouse to protect his assets. She is framing your downtown revitalization project as a giant fraud." I slammed my hands down on my desk. "That is an absolute lie," I shouted, my voice cracking with indignation. "I gave Julian $200,000 of my own savings for that penthouse. My business is funded entirely by legitimate investors and my own capital." Marcus held up his hands in surrender. "I believe you, Simone. But you have to understand the kind of power Beatrice holds. These investors care about their reputations and their social standing. Nobody in the elite circle is going to risk alienating Beatrice's family over a middle-class developer. You are radioactive right now. Anyone who associates with you risks getting cut off from the most lucrative social networks in the South." The reality of his words hit me like a physical blow. Beatrice had flipped the narrative entirely. She had taken her son's infidelity and cruelty and spun it into a story of my deception and greed. She had painted me as a barren, gold-digging thief who preyed on her innocent, wealthy son. It was a masterclass in social manipulation, and it was working perfectly. Within 2 weeks, the malicious smear campaign began to yield devastating financial results. I had spent months securing commitments from 3 of the largest commercial investment groups in the city. They were the financial pillars holding my entire dream together. The first pillar crumbled on a Tuesday morning. I received an impersonal email from the Vanguard Investment Group stating they were withdrawing their funding commitment effective immediately. There was no explanation provided, just a cold corporate notification. I frantically called their lead managing partner, but my calls were blocked. The second blow came on Thursday. I had a scheduled lunch meeting with the directors of the Peachtree Capital Coalition. I arrived at the upscale restaurant carrying a briefcase full of updated financial projections. I sat at the reserved table for an hour waiting for them to arrive. They never showed up. When I called their office, a receptionist coldly informed me that the partners had decided to pass on my project. They did not even have the basic courtesy to cancel the meeting to my face. By Friday afternoon, I was in a state of absolute panic. My operating budget was shrinking rapidly. I was bleeding money paying for holding fees on the warehouse properties. I needed the final investor to stay on board, or the entire project would collapse. I drove directly to the offices of the Southern Horizon Development Fund, refusing to leave until I spoke with the managing director. Mr. Harrison was a seasoned investor who had always championed my vision. When he finally agreed to see me, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and regret. He did not invite me to sit down. "Simone, your project is solid," he said, leaning against his heavy oak desk. "The numbers make sense. But I cannot fund you. My board of directors had an emergency meeting this morning. We are pulling out." I stepped forward, my voice thick with desperation. "Mr. Harrison, you know this project will generate massive returns. Do not let these baseless rumors dictate your business decisions. I can open my books right now." He shook his head, cutting me off. "This is not about your books, Simone. This is about liability. My partners play golf with Julian's uncle. Our wives sit on the same charity committees as Beatrice. Beatrice made it very clear that any firm that backs your project will be entirely blacklisted from all future deals involving her family and their extended network. I cannot risk my firm's entire portfolio for one development. You are a pariah, Simone. No one in this city is going to write you a check. You need to cut your losses and leave Atlanta." I walked out of his office feeling like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The rejection was absolute. The walls of the city had completely closed in on me. Beatrice had successfully weaponized her social standing to orchestrate my total financial ruin. I drove back to my empty office building, the silence pressing heavily against my eardrums. I sat in my desk chair, staring blankly at the massive blueprints of the revitalization project pinned to the wall. The warehouses, the luxury lofts, the community spaces. It was all slipping through my fingers. The project I had sacrificed my youth to build was dead. I opened my laptop and looked at my business bank accounts. Without the investor capital, I could not pay the holding fees on the commercial properties. Within 30 days, the banks would foreclose on the warehouses. My company would be forced into bankruptcy. I would lose absolutely everything. I had already lost my fiancé, my home, and my dream of a family. Now I was going to lose my livelihood and my professional reputation. Beatrice and Julian had made a calculated effort to salt the earth so nothing would ever grow for me again. They wanted me destitute, disgraced, and driven out of the city entirely. I rested my heavy head on my desk, the sheer exhaustion and terror finally breaking through my resolve. The room began to spin in slow, sickening circles. For weeks, I had been running on nothing but black coffee and adrenaline, trying to save my business from the vicious social sabotage Beatrice had orchestrated. My body had been sending me warning signs, but I had ignored them completely. I had written off the morning nausea as anxiety. I had blamed the extreme fatigue on my 18-hour workdays. I thought the sharp, dizzy spells were just the natural consequence of watching my entire life fall apart. But as I sat there in my quiet office, a sudden sharp pain ripped through my lower abdomen. It was not a dull ache. It was a fierce, stabbing sensation that took my breath away. I gasped, clutching the edge of my desk as a wave of intense heat washed over my entire body. Dark spots danced in the corners of my vision. I tried to stand up to call out for my assistant in the hallway, but my legs completely gave out beneath me. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, knocking a stack of architectural blueprints down with me. The world faded into a thick gray fog, and the last thing I heard was the sound of my office door swinging open and my assistant screaming my name. When I finally opened my eyes, the environment was entirely unfamiliar. There were no velvet chairs or mahogany tables or soft ambient lighting. I was lying on a stiff, narrow bed under harsh, bright fluorescent lights. The air smelled strongly of bleach and clinical antiseptic. The chaotic sounds of a busy emergency room echoed around me. Nurses were shouting medical codes down the hallway, and machines beeped incessantly in every direction. This was a public state-run hospital right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a place entirely disconnected from the private exclusive clinics controlled by Beatrice's elite social circle. Nobody here cared about high society pedigrees or country club memberships. They only cared about keeping people alive. A tall doctor wearing wrinkled blue scrubs and a stethoscope around his neck walked into my curtained area. He held a metal clipboard and looked down at me with a serious but kind expression. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans. He asked me how I was feeling, and I told him about the severe abdominal pain and the dizzy spells. I confessed that I had been under an unimaginable amount of stress recently, and assumed I was having a panic attack or a bleeding ulcer. Dr. Evans listened carefully, making notes on my chart. He told me they had already drawn my blood while I was unconscious and ran a comprehensive panel to check for any serious internal issues. He also mentioned that he wanted to do a quick abdominal ultrasound, just to rule out any immediate physical trauma to my internal organs. A nurse wheeled a portable ultrasound machine to the side of my bed. I stared up at the ceiling tiles, preparing myself for more devastating news. I was convinced that the stress had caused a tumor, or that my premature ovarian failure diagnosis had suddenly progressed into something fatal. I felt the cold clinical gel being squeezed onto my lower stomach. Dr. Evans pressed the ultrasound wand against my skin, moving it around slowly, while keeping his eyes glued to the small monitor. The room was quiet for a long, terrifying moment. Dr. Evans frowned, his eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He stopped moving the wand and looked from the monitor down to my face, and then back to the monitor again. He tapped a few buttons on the keyboard, adjusting the contrast on the screen. "Simone," he said, his voice laced with absolute bewilderment. "Looking at your medical history file. Here it says you recently received treatment at a private clinic in Buckhead. Who exactly told you that you were infertile?" The question caught me completely off guard. My heart began to pound frantically against my ribs. I swallowed hard, fighting back the sudden lump in my throat. "Dr. Sterling," I answered, my voice trembling. "He is a very prominent fertility specialist. He told me a few weeks ago that my ovarian reserve was completely depleted. He said I had premature ovarian failure and that I would never be able to conceive a biological child." Dr. Evans let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh of disbelief. He shook his head and turned the ultrasound monitor so that I could see the screen. "I do not know what kind of game that private clinic is playing, Simone, but that doctor flat out lied to you. Not only is your reproductive health perfectly fine, but you have an incredibly strong uterine lining. There is absolutely no sign of ovarian failure anywhere in your system." I stared at the blurry black and white images on the screen, trying to comprehend his words. My brain simply refused to process the information. Lied to me. How could a doctor lie about something so permanent, so devastating? But that is not the most important part. Dr. Evans continued, a warm, genuine smile finally breaking across his exhausted face. He reached out and pointed a gloved finger at two distinct dark circles on the monitor. He pressed another button on the machine, and suddenly, a rapid, rhythmic swooshing sound filled the small hospital bay. It sounded like the rapid galloping of tiny horses. "Simone," Dr. Evans said softly, "you are not infertile, you are pregnant, and judging by these measurements, you are about 12 weeks along, with twins." The galloping sound coming from the machine was the sound of two perfect, healthy heartbeats. I stopped breathing entirely. I stared at the two little fluttering shapes on the screen, and a massive tidal wave of emotion crashed over me. Tears spilled out of my eyes and streamed down my face. I brought my trembling hands up to cover my mouth, stifling the loud sob that tore through my chest. Pregnant. Twins. I was going to be a mother. The very dream I thought had been permanently stolen from me was actually growing safely inside my own body. But as the initial shock and overwhelming joy washed through me, a sudden sharp realization hit my mind like a bolt of lightning. Julian was not the father. He could not possibly be the father because Julian and I had stopped being intimate months before our final clinic appointment. Our relationship had been deteriorating long before the false diagnosis ever happened. The absolute truth of how these babies came to exist was a secret I had guarded with my life. A secret that now felt like the most profound miracle in the universe. 4 months ago, I had started noticing the subtle, agonizing signs of Julian's infidelity. He was coming home late from the wealth management fund, smelling faintly of a floral perfume that did not belong to me. He was hiding his phone screen when he texted and picking fights over meaningless things just to have an excuse to leave the penthouse. I knew in my gut that he was cheating on me. I also knew that my biological clock was ticking, and I had spent years delaying motherhood to build my commercial real estate business and support his career ambitions. I realized then that Julian might walk away from our engagement, and I refused to let his betrayal rob me of my fundamental desire to become a mother. I had taken matters into my own hands entirely independent of Julian. While he thought I was traveling to a commercial real estate conference out of state, I had secretly booked a private appointment at a highly exclusive premium fertility center in a different city. I paid out of pocket to ensure absolute discretion. I spent hours reviewing extensive donor profiles from a premium sperm bank, eventually selecting a donor with impeccable credentials, brilliant academic records, and a clean health history. I underwent a specialized and highly accelerated in vitro fertilization procedure, using my own eggs. I kept the entire procedure a complete secret when I returned to Atlanta. I was waiting to see if the embryos actually took before making any major life decisions, and I was simultaneously quietly evaluating my relationship with Julian, preparing myself to call off the wedding if my suspicions of his cheating were confirmed. But before I could take a pregnancy test, Julian insisted we go to Dr. Sterling for a comprehensive fertility checkup, claiming his mother, Beatrice, was demanding a full health panel before the wedding invitations were mailed out. That clinic visit changed everything. Dr. Sterling had looked me in the eye and delivered the devastating news that my eggs were gone. That fake diagnosis had completely derailed my sense of reality. The shock and grief were so absolute that I never even thought to take a simple over-the-counter pregnancy test. The severe stress of the breakup, the eviction, and the ongoing social sabotage had masked the early physical symptoms of my pregnancy. Now lying in a bed at a public hospital, staring at the miraculous evidence on the ultrasound monitor, all the puzzle pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Dr. Sterling did not make a medical error. Beatrice Sterling was a woman who controlled everything and everyone around her with ruthless precision. She had vast amounts of wealth and zero moral boundaries. I realized right then that Beatrice must have paid Dr. Sterling an exorbitant amount of money to falsify my medical records. She needed a socially acceptable reason for Julian to dump me and replace me with Valerie, the logistics heiress. Blaming the breakup on my fabricated infertility protected Julian's image as the perfect high society gentleman who only wanted to preserve his family legacy. But the implications went even deeper. If Beatrice went to such extreme criminal lengths to fake my infertility diagnosis, it meant she was hiding a massive secret of her own. She was deflecting. My mind raced, piecing together the timeline and the desperate cruelty of their actions. Julian was the one pushing for the immediate breakup. Beatrice was the one orchestrating the medical fraud. I looked down at my stomach, my hands resting gently against the hospital gown. I was carrying two perfectly healthy babies from an anonymous premium donor. My body was completely capable. My reproductive health was stellar. I was entirely whole. A fierce burning power ignited in my blood, replacing the exhaustion and terror that had brought me to this hospital bed. They tried to bury me under a mountain of lies. They tried to strip away my dignity, my career, and my future by branding me as a broken, useless woman. But they had failed. I was not broken. I was a mother holding the ultimate truth in the palm of my hands. I wiped my tears away and thanked Dr. Evans with a newfound strength vibrating in my voice. I asked him for printed copies of all my blood panels, my hormone levels, and the ultrasound images. I needed every single piece of medical documentation to prove that my reproductive system was completely flawless. I was going to secure the undisputed medical receipts. As I walked out of that state-run hospital, clutching the manila envelope containing the first pictures of my twins, a dangerous smile touched the corners of my mouth. Beatrice and Julian had started a war based on a catastrophic lie. I was going to let them enjoy their fake victory a little longer. I was going to let them build their entire public reputation on this deception. And then, when the timing was absolutely perfect, I was going to use the truth to execute the most elegant and destructive revenge Atlanta elite society had ever witnessed. My first step was securing a weapon that Beatrice could not simply dismiss with a wave of her manicured hand. I needed someone who operated entirely outside the polished country club circles she controlled. Through a discreet contact in the commercial real estate world, I found Silas. I was a former federal investigator who now ran a private intelligence firm specializing in corporate espionage and high society scandals. His clientele consisted of people who needed airtight, undeniable proof to destroy their enemies. His retainers were astronomically high, but I did not care. I liquidated a portion of my emergency retirement fund and wired him his fee without a second thought. This was no longer just about salvaging my reputation. This was a tactical war for my survival and the protection of my unborn twins. I met Silas at a secure location, an unmarked office building on the outskirts of Atlanta. I handed him the manila envelope containing my real medical records from the public hospital, along with the fake diagnosis report from the private Buckhead clinic. I told him everything about Julian, my eviction, and the vicious smear campaign Beatrice was currently running against me. Silas listened in complete silence, taking notes on a secured tablet. I gave him one clear directive. I told him to tear into the financial and digital footprint of the fertility clinic and Beatrice. I needed to know exactly how much it cost for a prominent doctor to risk his medical license by faking a catastrophic diagnosis. For the next 10 days, I maintained an incredibly low profile. I stopped fighting the investors who were pulling out of my downtown revitalization project. I let Beatrice believe her social sabotage was working perfectly. I focused entirely on my health, ensuring I was eating properly and resting to protect my high-risk twin pregnancy. Every time I felt the slight flutter of nausea, I smiled, knowing that the very thing Beatrice accused me of lacking was currently shielding me from her toxic family. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Silas called my secure line and told me to come to his office immediately. When I walked into his dimly lit workspace, he had multiple monitors set up on his desk, displaying complex financial webs and heavily redacted medical codes. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He handed me a thick printed dossier. "Your instincts were absolutely correct, Simone," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. Beatrice left a digital paper trail, but she tried very hard to bury it. I had to trace a series of complex wire transfers through 3 different shell corporations before I found the smoking gun. Silas tapped his keyboard and brought up a bank statement on the largest monitor. It showed a withdrawal from a private offshore trust fund managed exclusively by Beatrice. The withdrawal was for exactly $150,000. Silas then traced that money as it moved through a maze of dummy accounts in the Cayman Islands before finally landing in a private wealth management account registered to the lead fertility doctor at the Buckhead clinic. "Look at the date," Silas instructed, pointing a laser pen at the screen. I leaned in closely and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The wire transfer of $150,000 had been completed exactly 48 hours before my devastating appointment with Julian. Beatrice had literally purchased my fake infertility diagnosis for the price of a luxury sports car. She had paid a licensed medical professional to look me in the eye and tell me my body was permanently broken, just so her son could have a socially acceptable excuse to abandon me. The sheer calculated malice of her actions took my breath away. She had weaponized my deepest vulnerability without a single shred of human empathy. But that is only the first layer of the deception. Silas continued, his voice dropping to a serious low register. Once I confirmed the bribery, I knew there had to be a foundational lie they were covering up. If your reproductive health was perfect, as your new hospital records prove, then why did Beatrice need to fake your diagnosis at all? Why not just tell Julian to break off the engagement normally? I looked at Silas, my mind racing through the possibilities. Because they needed a scapegoat, they needed to make sure Julian looked like the tragic victim of a deceptive woman, rather than a man who simply cheated on his fiancée with a wealthy heiress. Silas shook his head slowly. "No, Simone. The cheating was a symptom of a much larger problem. They needed to make you the broken one because they were desperately hiding who was actually broken. He turned back to his computer monitors. I had to utilize some highly unconventional methods to bypass the Buckhead Clinic's encrypted servers. The clinic had scrubbed your original blood work and replaced it with fabricated data to match the fake diagnosis. But they forgot that their laboratory testing machines automatically back up raw data to a secondary secure server before any doctor can manually alter the final patient report. I hacked into that secondary server and pulled the original unaltered lab results for both you and your ex-fiancé. Silas handed me a second folder, this one marked with a bright red, highly confidential stamp. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an official laboratory analysis report bearing Julian's full name, his date of birth, and his patient identification number. I scanned the dense medical terminology, my eyes searching for the conclusion section at the bottom of the page. When I read the final paragraph, my heart stopped beating completely. I read the words a second time and then a third time just to make sure my mind was not playing tricks on me. The laboratory report stated that Julian suffered from severe, irreversible, complete azoospermia. I looked up at Silas, my mouth open in absolute shock. Azoospermia. I whispered the clinical term out loud. That means he has zero sperm count, he is completely sterile. Silas nodded, his expression grim. Your ex-fiancé is shooting blanks, Simone. He has absolutely no viable sperm. The condition is genetic and completely untreatable. He will never be able to biologically father a child. The magnitude of the truth hit me with the force of an exploding bomb. Julian was the infertile one. His pristine high society bloodline ended permanently with him. The perfect golden boy of Atlanta elite society, the man who had looked at me with pure disgust and called me a dead branch, was entirely biologically incapable of reproducing. I sank into the chair across from Silas, letting the immense weight of the revelation wash over me. Beatrice knew. She must have demanded early access to the lab results before our consultation. When she saw that her precious son was the one carrying the genetic failure, she panicked. In her twisted elite world, a sterile male heir was an unforgivable weakness. It was a flaw that would subject their powerful family to the vicious whispers and pity of the country club gossips. Beatrice could not handle the idea of her friends knowing that the grand family legacy stopped with Julian. So she orchestrated the ultimate betrayal. She paid the clinic $150,000 to swap our diagnoses. She protected Julian's fragile masculine ego by shifting the entirety of the blame onto me. She let him believe that I was the defective partner, so he could walk away feeling powerful and justified in his cruelty. She essentially handed him a loaded gun to destroy my life just so she could shield his pride. A harsh, bitter laugh escaped my lips. The absolute audacity of their deception was staggering. They had thrown me out on the street, ruined my professional reputation, and caused me unimaginable emotional trauma, all to cover up the fact that Julian was sterile. But as the laughter faded, a new, much more explosive realization took its place. My mind immediately flashed back to the morning I had walked into the penthouse to retrieve my belongings. I remembered Beatrice proudly raising her crystal champagne flute. I remembered her looking at Valerie and making that triumphant announcement. To the beautiful, accomplished woman who is bringing true joy to this family. 4 weeks pregnant and already giving this family exactly what it deserves. A perfect, healthy heir to continue our legacy. I looked at Silas, my eyes wide with a terrifying, thrilling realization. Silas, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Valerie is pregnant. Beatrice announced her pregnancy to my face. She said Valerie was carrying Julian's child. Silas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He steepled his fingers together, looking at me with a sharp, predatory gleam in his eye. If Julian has absolute complete azoospermia, Simone, then it is a biological impossibility for him to impregnate any woman on Earth. We stared at each other as the ultimate truth settled over the room. Julian was not the father of Valerie's baby. The miracle heir that Beatrice was currently parading around high society was a complete sham. Valerie was carrying another man's child, and she was using Julian's vast wealth and prominent family name to secure her own luxurious future. Julian, the man who had ruthlessly discarded me because I could not provide him with a legacy, was currently planning a multi-million-dollar wedding to marry a woman who was actively deceiving him. The great matriarch Beatrice, who had paid a fortune to protect her sons, Pride was blissfully unaware that her highly anticipated grandchild carried absolutely none of her precious family bloodline. I gathered the thick stack of medical records and the wire transfer receipts, sliding them carefully back into the heavy manila envelope. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power coursing through my veins. Beatrice thought she had buried me under a mountain of carefully constructed lies. She believed her money and social influence made her completely untouchable. She assumed I was just a weak middle-class girl who would quietly accept her destruction and fade away into obscurity. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed me the very weapon I needed to obliterate her entire empire. I had the concrete, undeniable receipts. I had the medical proof of Julian's sterility. I had the financial evidence of Beatrice's bribery. And I had the explosive knowledge that the highly anticipated elite family heir was nothing but a bastard child born from an illicit affair. Silas, I said, standing up and clutching the envelope tightly against my chest. I need you to shift your entire focus. Stop digging into Beatrice and the fertility clinic. We have everything we need from them. I need you to put all your resources into tracking Valerie. I need to know absolutely everything about her movements, her phone records, and her private schedules. If Julian is not the father of that baby, I need to know exactly whose bed she has been climbing into. Silas smiled a cold, calculating smile that perfectly matched my own. Consider it done, he said. We will find out exactly who is planting seeds in the royal garden. I walked out of his office and stepped into the cool Atlanta night air. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. I placed my hand gently over my lower stomach, feeling the safe, hidden presence of my own healthy twins. I had the truth. I had the evidence. Now all I needed was the financial backing to ensure that when I dropped this bomb, nobody in the elite circles of Atlanta could shield Julian and Beatrice from the devastating fallout. I was going to let them plan their extravagant society wedding. I was going to let them climb to the very top of their pedestal of lies. And then I was going to kick the pedestal completely out from under them. I needed capital. Having the ultimate truth locked in my safe was empowering, but truth alone could not pay the holding fees on my commercial properties. Beatrice's malicious whisper campaign was still actively suffocating my business. If the banks foreclosed on my downtown revitalization project before I had the chance to execute my revenge, Beatrice would still win half the battle. I refused to let her destroy my life's work. I needed an investor who operated entirely outside the toxic social ecosystem of Atlanta elite society. Someone with enough wealth and power to completely ignore Beatrice's ridiculous country club blacklists. The opportunity presented itself 3 days later in the form of a high-stakes commercial real estate mixer hosted at the St. Regis Hotel. It was an exclusive invite-only event designed to connect major developers with national private equity firms. A former colleague who still respected my work managed to slip me a guest pass. I knew walking into that ballroom would be like walking straight into a lion's den. Beatrice and Julian were bound to be there, rubbing elbows with the city's wealthiest families. But absolute desperation bred courage. I dressed for total warfare. I selected a tailored midnight blue pantsuit that perfectly masked the slight early rounding of my twin pregnancy. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe bun and wore the highest stiletto heels I owned. I looked like a woman who was absolutely thriving. Nobody in that room was going to see me bleed. When I walked into the grand ballroom, the massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over a sea of designer suits and expensive evening gowns. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and scanned the room. It did not take long for the temperature around me to drop. The moment the local investors recognized me, they immediately turned their backs. Conversations abruptly stopped as I walked past. People whispered behind their hands, casting judgmental glances in my direction. Beatrice's smear campaign had thoroughly poisoned the well. Then I saw them. Julian and Valerie were holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of prominent bankers. Valerie was wearing a clinging silk dress, deliberately pushing out her stomach to emphasize her fake 4-week baby bump. Julian stood beside her, beaming with unearned pride. He looked like the picture-perfect heir showing off his future legacy to his wealthy peers. Julian spotted me first. His confident smile vanished instantly, replaced by a scowl of deep annoyance. He whispered something to Valerie, who immediately turned and glared at me. Instead of backing away, I walked directly toward their circle, holding my head high. Simone Julian sneered loudly enough for the surrounding bankers to hear. I am incredibly surprised security let you in here. I thought you would be busy packing up your failed little business by now. Valerie let out a high-pitched mocking laugh. She leaned against Julian, placing a protective hand over her flat stomach. Really, Simone, she purred. You should not be in such stressful environments. It is not good for your fragile mental state. Or did you come here hoping to steal investment capital the same way you tried to steal from Julian? The surrounding bankers exchanged uncomfortable glances, pulling away from me as if I were contagious. They were all terrified of crossing Julian and his powerful mother. I did not flinch. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and offered Julian a cool, detached smile. I am here to do business, Julian, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Something you clearly know very little about, considering you spend your days living off your mother's allowances and parading around a fake empire. Julian's face turned bright red. You are a delusional, barren woman, Simone. Get out of my sight before I have you thrown out. I turned my back on them, completely unbothered by his pathetic insults. I walked over to a quiet corner of the ballroom, refusing to let them see even a fraction of the immense pressure I was under. I stood by a large marble pillar, scanning the room for any potential out-of-town investors. That was when I noticed him. He was standing alone near the balcony doors, watching the entire exchange with intense, quiet fascination. He was strikingly handsome, tall, with broad shoulders and a sharp jawline, but he did not carry the arrogant swagger of the Buckhead elite. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit without a tie, exuding an aura of quiet, lethal power. He held a glass of bourbon and his dark eyes were locked directly on me. He walked over his steps, deliberate and confident. He stopped beside me, looking out at the crowded ballroom before turning his gaze to my face. You handled that beautifully, he said, his voice a deep, rich baritone. Most people would have crumbled under that kind of public humiliation. You did not even blink. I turned to face him, my guard instantly up. When you know the exact value of the people insulting you, their words lose all meaning, I replied smoothly. And who exactly are you? I extended a large, warm hand. Dominic Vance. I recently relocated my private equity firm from New York to Atlanta. I prefer to observe these events rather than participate in the usual circus. I recognized the name immediately. Dominic Vance was a self-made billionaire and absolute titan in the private equity sector. He did not inherit his wealth like the pampered legacy children in this room. He built his empire through ruthless, highly profitable acquisitions and operating completely under the radar. He was known for tearing apart bloated, lazy corporations and restructuring them for maximum efficiency. He was exactly the kind of investor I needed. Someone who did not care about Beatrice's country club gossip or the delicate sensibilities of old money families. I shook his hand, my mind racing with sudden electric hope. Simone, I introduced myself, maintaining direct eye contact. I am a commercial real estate developer. And since you prefer observing over participating, Mr. Vance, perhaps you would be interested in observing the most lucrative revitalization project currently available in this city. Dominic raised an eyebrow, a slow, intrigued smile spreading across his face. You have my full attention, Simone. Pitch it to me. Right there in the corner of the ballroom, while Julian and Valerie continued to flaunt their fraudulent relationship. I opened my briefcase. I did not just show him pretty pictures. I showed him the raw structural integrity reports, the projected gentrification maps, and the city council tax abatements I had personally negotiated. I explained how the abandoned warehouse district was geographically positioned to become the next major tech hub, linking the downtown financial sector with the newly developed residential corridors. I broke down the risk-to-reward ratio, proving that the initial capital injection would yield a 200% return within the first 36 months of lease agreements. I pitched with the absolute fierce desperation of a woman fighting for her life, but I kept my delivery sharp, clinical, and undeniably professional. Dominic listened in complete silence. He reviewed the documents, his dark eyes scanning the numbers with lightning speed. He asked 3 highly technical questions about the structural integrity of the warehouses and the environmental impact studies. I answered them flawlessly. He closed the folder and handed it back to me. His expression was serious, but the intrigued smile remained in his eyes. Your numbers are solid, Simone, he said. In fact, they are exceptional. But I have to ask, why is a project this lucrative struggling to find local capital? I saw how those bankers looked at you earlier. You are clearly blacklisted. Why? I looked at Dominic, weighing the massive risk of telling the truth. I needed his money, but I also needed a strategic ally who would not be spooked by high society warfare. I decided to gamble everything on his ruthless reputation. I am blacklisted because the man who just insulted me is the vice president of a prominent wealth management fund. I explained, my voice dropping to a low, confidential register. His mother controls the social and financial networks in this city. They orchestrated a massive smear campaign against me to cover up a deeply humiliating family secret. They are trying to bankrupt my company to force me out of Atlanta. Dominic took a sip of his bourbon, his eyes never leaving mine. And what are you going to do about it, Simone? I am going to take their money, I replied coldly. I am going to let them plan $1 million society wedding. I am going to let them build their entire public reputation on a massive lie. And then I am going to publicly execute their legacy and burn their entire empire to the ground. I have the medical and financial receipts to do it. All I need is the capital to keep my commercial properties out of foreclosure until the timing is perfectly ripe. Dominic stared at me for a long, silent moment. The air between us cracked with sudden, intense electricity. He was not looking at me with pity or judgment. He was looking at me with profound, undeniable respect. He recognized a fellow predator. He reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. Have your legal team send the development contracts to my office tomorrow morning, Simone, he said softly. I will fully fund your revitalization project. I do not care about local gossip, and I certainly do not care about the delicate feelings of the Buckhead elite. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for weeks. Thank you, Dominic, I said, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. You will not regret this investment. Dominic leaned in, slightly lowering his head so his mouth was close to my ear. His scent was a mix of expensive cedar and bourbon. I am sure I will not, he murmured. But since we are going into business together, Simone, you should know that I also appreciate a beautifully executed revenge strategy, especially against arrogant men who pretend to be kings. I looked at him curiously, my heart beating a little faster. What do you mean? Dominic glanced across the ballroom directly at Julian, who was currently laughing loudly with a group of investors. Dominic smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver of absolute thrill straight down my spine. That wealth management fund where your ex-fiancé sits as vice president, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. My private equity firm has been quietly buying up their toxic debt for the past 6 months. We are currently in the final stages of a highly aggressive hostile takeover. By the time that wedding happens, I will officially own his entire company. I will be his boss. I gasped, my eyes widening in pure shock. I looked from Dominic to Julian, and then back to Dominic. The universe had not just sent me an investor, it had sent me an absolute executioner. Dominic stepped back, adjusting his suit jacket. Let them plan their extravagant wedding, Simone. Let them think they have won. When you are ready to drop your bombs and destroy his family legacy, I will be standing right beside you, ready to strip away every single dollar of his corporate power. We are going to ruin him completely. I gripped the black business card in my hand, feeling a fierce, burning power radiate through my entire body. The card felt heavier than gold. It was a tangible promise of survival and retribution. Beatrice and Julian thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They assumed their combined social and financial weight would crush me into dust, leaving no trace of my existence in their pristine world. They had no idea they had just pushed me directly into the arms of a billionaire titan who held the keys to their complete financial destruction. As I watched Julian clink his champagne glass with Valerie, celebrating their fraudulent victory, I smiled, a genuine, chilling smile. The trap was set, the alliance was forged, and the countdown to absolute ruin had officially begun. The next morning, I was sitting back in Silas' private office. The adrenaline from the night before was still running hot through my veins. Dominic had kept his word. By 8 in the morning, his legal team had sent over the signed contracts fully funding my commercial real estate project. My business was completely secured. My properties were safe from foreclosure. Now I could dedicate my entire focus to the offensive strategy. I placed my coffee on Silas' desk and leaned forward. "We have a new target," I told him. "Beatrice and Julian are neutralized. We know their secret. But Valerie is the wild card. If Julian has absolute complete azoospermia, he cannot possibly be the father of that baby. Valerie is playing a very dangerous game of high society roulette, and she is using Julian as her wealthy mark. I need you to find out exactly who is actually fathering that child." Silas nodded, his eyes lighting up with the thrill of the hunt. He immediately deployed his team to monitor Valerie's every move. For the first few days, her routine was painfully boring and predictable. She played the role of the perfect high society bride to be flawlessly. Silas sent me daily reports showing her attending exclusive bridal fittings with Beatrice, having lunch at the country club, and shopping for luxury baby clothes at high-end Buckhead boutiques. She was happily spending Julian's money, wrapping herself in the illusion of grandeur. But Silas was a former federal investigator who knew how to spot the microscopic cracks in a perfect facade. He noticed a pattern in her late-night behavior. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Valerie would tell Julian she was going to prenatal yoga or visiting her parents. Instead, she would drive her luxury sports utility vehicle straight into the underground parking garage of Julian's wealth management firm. Julian usually left the office by 6 to attend networking dinners or drink with his elite fraternity brothers. The firm was practically deserted by 8 o'clock. Silas knew that getting inside the building physically would risk exposure, so he took a digital route. Because Dominic's private equity firm was in the final stages of a hostile takeover of Julian's company, Dominic had covertly secured access to their internal servers for due diligence purposes. With Dominic's quiet blessing, Silas bypassed the corporate firewalls and tapped directly into the high-definition security cameras installed throughout the executive suites. What he found was so explosive it felt like a movie script. It was a Thursday night when Silas called me back to his unmarked office building. "You are going to want to sit down for this, Simone," he said, his voice completely flat. I walked into his dimly lit workspace and took a seat in the heavy leather chair. He turned his largest high-resolution monitor toward me and hit play on a video file. The footage was stamped with a timestamp from 2 nights ago. It showed the interior of Julian's massive corner office. The room was dark except for the streetlights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy oak door swung open and Valerie walked in. She was wearing a clinging designer dress, her fake baby bump barely visible. She locked the door behind her and walked straight toward Julian's massive mahogany executive desk. But she was not there to surprise Julian. Someone else stepped out from the shadows of the private adjoining bathroom. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The man walking toward Valerie was not a stranger. He was tall, with a lazy, arrogant smirk and a relaxed posture that lacked all of Julian's rigid corporate discipline. It was Andre, Julian's 30-year-old younger brother. Andre was the infamous black sheep of the family. While Julian was groomed to be the perfect corporate heir, Andre was the spoiled, lazy playboy who refused to hold down a real job. He spent his days draining Beatrice's trust funds, gambling in exclusive rooms, and bouncing between failed startup ideas. Beatrice constantly made excuses for Andre's failures, while Julian treated his younger brother with barely concealed contempt. Julian viewed Andre as a pathetic embarrassment to their pristine family name. On the security footage, Andre grabbed Valerie by the waist and pulled her against him. They kissed with a frantic, desperate hunger that spoke of a long, ongoing affair. Valerie ran her hands through Andre's hair, laughing as he lifted her effortlessly and set her right down on the center of Julian's immaculate mahogany desk. They swept Julian's expensive corporate files and framed photographs onto the floor without a second thought. The sheer disrespect was staggering. They were defiling Julian's sacred executive workspace, making an absolute mockery of his authority right under his nose. I watched the screen in stunned silence as the two of them engaged in a passionate, highly explicit encounter. The camera captured every single detail in crystal-clear 4K resolution. There was no denying who they were or what they were doing. This was not a one-time mistake. Their body language revealed a deep, comfortable familiarity. They had been doing this for months. They were entirely brazen confident that they would never be caught. Silas paused the video right on a perfectly illuminated frame of their faces locked together in passion. He looked at me, his expression grim, but victorious. I checked the building access log, Silas explained. Andre uses a master keycard he stole from Julian's assistant. Valerie uses a guest pass she claims she needs for wedding planning meetings. They have been meeting in Julian's office twice a week since long before you and Julian ever broke up. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind, forming a picture of absolute grotesque betrayal. Valerie had not just trapped Julian for his money, she was sleeping with his younger brother behind his back. And because Julian suffered from complete azoospermia, the undeniable biological truth was staring me right in the face. The golden bloodline that Beatrice was so incredibly proud of, the precious legacy heir that Julian believed he was passing his name down to, did not belong to him. The baby Valerie was carrying was Andre's child. The jobless, spoiled black sheep of the family had impregnated the woman meant to be his brother's trophy wife. The child was technically still a part of Beatrice's bloodline, but it was the product of ultimate betrayal and deception. Julian was unknowingly preparing to raise his own brother's bastard child, while proudly parading it around high society as his own miracle. I leaned back in the leather chair, letting out a long breath. The irony was so poetic it almost hurt. Beatrice had destroyed my life completely to protect Julian's masculine pride. She had paid a doctor to frame me as barren because she could not accept that her golden boy was flawed. Now that very same pride had blinded them all to the massive parasitic lie growing right in the center of their family tree. Beatrice was so desperate to secure an heir that she never questioned the miraculous timing of Valerie's pregnancy. She never questioned how her sterile son had suddenly achieved the impossible. She just accepted the convenient lie because it fit her perfect narrative. Silas, I said, my voice trembling with pure adrenaline, I need every single second of this footage downloaded. I want it backed up on multiple encrypted hard drives. I want high-resolution screenshots of their faces. I want the building access logs printed and compiled. I want a complete comprehensive file documenting every single time they stepped into that office together. Silas tapped his keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys. I am already rendering the files, Simone. You will have everything on a secure flash drive before you leave this office. It is completely untraceable. They have absolutely no idea they are being watched. I took the silver flash drive from Silas, dropping it into my designer handbag like it was a loaded grenade. It felt heavy with the weight of impending justice. This tiny piece of metal held the power to dismantle a dynasty that had terrorized anyone they deemed beneath them. I thanked Silas for his brilliant, flawless work. He assured me he would keep monitoring the cameras just to build an even larger archive of their indiscretions should we need an encore. I walked out of his office and stepped into the humid Atlanta night. I drove straight to the luxury high-rise where Dominic resided. I had to show him what we had uncovered. When I arrived at his penthouse, he poured us both a glass of sparkling water and loaded the flash drive onto his personal secure server. We sat together in his dark, modern living room, watching the security footage play out on his massive television screen. Dominic let out a low, appreciative whistle as Andre and Valerie defiled Julian's desk. Your ex-fiancé is a completely oblivious fool, Dominic stated, leaning back into the sofa. He is so obsessed with looking powerful that he cannot see the absolute rot eating away at his own family from the inside out. He actually thinks he is the king of the castle, while his own brother is conquering his queen right on the throne. I smiled, taking a sip of my water. Beatrice is the real architect of this disaster, I replied. She forced this narrative. She demanded a perfect heir, and she did not care who she had to crush to get it. Now she is going to get exactly what she paid for. An heir built on theft, lies, and betrayal. Dominic looked at me, his dark eyes shining with intense admiration. He reached out and gently rested his hand over mine. You have built an impenetrable case, Simone. When the time comes, I will make sure my corporate takeover aligns perfectly with your social execution. Julian will lose his job the exact same moment he loses his family and his dignity. He will have absolutely nothing left to fall back on. We spent the next few hours finalizing our timeline. I was going to focus on nurturing my growing twins and managing the explosive growth of my commercial real estate development. Dominic was going to quietly finalize the hostile acquisition of the wealth management fund, wrapping his financial fingers tightly around Julian's neck without him ever noticing. We were operating in complete stealth while the family loudly paraded their impending wedding across every high society magazine and charity newsletter in the state. They thought they had won. They thought they had discarded a broken, useless woman and successfully hidden their shameful genetic flaws. They thought their wealth made them invincible. But they were dancing on a floor covered in gasoline, and I was holding the only match. I had the ultimate receipts. I had the capital. I had the power. Now all I needed was an invitation to the most anticipated wedding of the year. The commercial real estate project did not just succeed, it completely redefined the downtown landscape of the city. With Dominic's massive financial backing and strategic guidance, we transformed the abandoned warehouse district into the most highly coveted luxury commercial space in the entire southern region. Boutique tech firms, upscale restaurants, and elite art galleries fought tooth and nail to secure leases in our newly renovated buildings. I was no longer a struggling developer, fighting for scraps at country club mixers. I was the reigning queen of Atlanta commercial real estate. My company valuation tripled, and my professional reputation was absolutely untouchable. And I did it all while carrying two perfectly healthy growing baby boys. At 9 months pregnant, I was a formidable sight. My body had transformed beautifully to accommodate my twins. I did not hide my pregnancy behind baggy clothes or oversized coats. I wore tailored maternity suits that highlighted my massive bump, pairing them with the same fierce stiletto heels I had always worn. I was glowing, vibrating with a kind of maternal and professional power that made people stop and stare when I walked into a boardroom. Dominic was right beside me through every single moment of it. He attended every ultrasound, held my hand during the late-night strategic planning sessions, and slowly but surely became the most important man in my life. Our business alliance had evolved into a deep, passionate romance built on absolute mutual respect. He was fiercely protective of me and the twins, claiming them as his own without a second thought. We were building an empire together while operating entirely off the radar of Julian and his toxic mother. For 9 months, Beatrice and Julian had absolutely no idea where I was or what I was doing. They assumed their vicious smear campaign had successfully driven me out of their pristine high society circles. They thought I had crawled away to lick my wounds in middle-class obscurity. They were busy flaunting Valerie's fake pregnancy and throwing lavish society engagement parties, completely blind to the corporate execution Dominic was meticulously preparing in the background. Then on a crisp Tuesday morning, the final piece of the puzzle was delivered directly to my desk. I was sitting in my newly renovated corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline when my assistant walked in carrying a heavy cream-colored envelope. The thick cardstock was sealed with dripping gold wax, stamped with the arrogant crest of the wealth management firm Julian worked for. He had actually used his corporate courier to deliver personal mail. I broke the wax seal with my silver letter opener and pulled out the contents. It was a wedding invitation. But it was not just any invitation. It was a grotesque display of excessive wealth. The heavy parchment was lined with embossed gold foil featuring elaborate calligraphy that announced the union of Julian and Valerie. The ceremony and reception were scheduled for this coming Saturday at the St. Regis Hotel. It was the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta elite society venues, reserved only for the wealthiest and most influential families. But the formal invitation was not what made my blood boil. A small piece of heavy stationery fluttered out from the envelope and landed on my desk. It was a handwritten note penned in Julian's familiar jagged handwriting. I picked it up and read the words carefully. Valerie and I are tying the knot at the St. Regis this Saturday. My mother insisted we invite you. We thought you might want to see what a real complete woman looks like. Come witness the beginning of our legacy if you can handle it. I stared at the note, letting the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words sink in. He was inviting me to his wedding, solely to publicly humiliate me one last time. He wanted me to stand in the back of a crowded ballroom, watching him marry a pregnant heiress, so he could gloat over my supposed barrenness. And Beatrice wanted to parade Valerie's stolen pregnancy in my face to prove their absolute superiority. They wanted to twist the knife thinking I would show up looking broken and defeated just to beg for crumbs from their high society table. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I threw my head back and let out a sharp, ringing laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. It was the laugh of a predator who had just watched her prey walk willingly into a steel trap. Dominic walked into my office a few moments later, holding 2 cups of decaffeinated tea. I took one look at my face and set the cups down on the glass table. "What is it?" he asked, his dark eyes narrowing in instant protective concern. I slid the handwritten note across my desk. "Read it," I instructed. Dominic picked up the heavy stationery. I watched his jaw clench as he read Julian's arrogant, cruel words. A dark, lethal shadow passed over Dominic's face. The air in my office instantly dropped 10 degrees. He placed the note back on the desk and looked at me, his expression deadly calm. "He actually thinks he is a king," Dominic said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He thinks he can invite you to his little party just to mock you. He wants to show me what a real complete woman looks like," I replied, standing up and smoothing my hands over my massive pregnant belly. "He wants to show off his glorious legacy. I think it would be incredibly rude of me to decline such a gracious invitation. Do you not agree?" Dominic smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that made my heart race with pure adrenaline. "I agree completely, Simone. In fact, I think we should give Julian a wedding gift he will never forget." Dominic stepped closer to me, gently resting his large, warm hands on either side of my baby bump. He looked down at my stomach and then back up into my eyes. "My legal team finalized the paperwork at 9 o'clock this morning, Simone. The hostile takeover is completely finished. I officially own his entire wealth management firm. I own the building he works in. I own his corporate accounts. I am technically his supreme boss, and he has absolutely no idea. We have the green light to execute." The thrill of his words sent a shockwave of electricity through my veins. The timing was absolutely flawless. Julian was planning to stand at the altar of the St. Regis Hotel, fueled by corporate arrogance and stolen wealth. He had no idea that the ground beneath his expensive tailored shoes had already collapsed. "If we are going to crash $1 million high society wedding," I said, turning to look at the Atlanta skyline through my window, "we need to make an entrance they will talk about for the next 50 years. I am not going to hide in the back of the room. I am going to walk right through the front doors." I spent the next 3 days preparing for absolute war. I did not go to a standard maternity store. I booked a private appointment at the most exclusive high-end designer boutique in Buckhead. I walked into the plush fitting room and told the head designer exactly what I wanted. I did not want pastel colors or soft, forgiving fabrics. I did not want to camouflage my 9-month twin pregnancy. I wanted a weaponized garment. I ordered a custom form-fitting crimson-red gown. The silk fabric hugged every single curve of my body, dramatically emphasizing the massive, proud swell of my stomach. It featured a plunging neckline and a dramatic sweeping train that demanded absolute attention. The bright crimson color was a deliberate choice. In a sea of muted pastels and traditional black tuxedos, I was going to look like a blazing fire. I was going to be the most undeniable, vibrant presence in the entire ballroom. I wanted the red to scream power, danger, and retribution. When I tried on the final fitting, I looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I did not look like the broken, sobbing woman Julian had discarded in that sterile fertility clinic 9 months ago. I looked like a queen preparing to execute a traitor. My skin was glowing, my posture was flawless, and my eyes held the cold, sharp promise of absolute destruction. While I perfected my armor, Dominic meticulously orchestrated the logistics of our ambush. He did not just plan to walk in with me, he weaponized the very venue itself. Because his private equity firm held massive corporate accounts with the St. Regis Hotel management, he leveraged his influence to infiltrate the wedding staff. Dominic quietly replaced 4 of the key event waitstaff with his own highly trained personal security team. They were instructed to blend in completely, wearing the hotel uniforms, while silently monitoring the perimeter of the grand ballroom. More importantly, Dominic secured control of the audiovisual systems. He paid a premium to the hotel management to ensure that his own trusted tech specialist was running the projector booth for the reception. Julian and Valerie had planned a disgustingly sweet romantic slideshow to be projected on massive screens during dinner. They wanted to force their guests to watch a curated montage of their fake perfect love story. We had a very different presentation planned for those screens. On the final night before the wedding, Dominic and I sat in his penthouse going over the digital arsenal one last time. We had 3 encrypted flash drives ready to go. Drive 1 contained the undeniable wire transfer receipts proving Beatrice bribed Dr. Vance with $150,000 to fake my medical diagnosis. Drive 2 contained the raw, unaltered laboratory results, proving Julian suffered from complete irreversible azoospermia. Drive 3 contained the explosive 4K security footage of Valerie and Andre passionately defiling Julian's executive desk. We placed the flash drives into a sleek silver carrying case. Everything was perfectly aligned: the medical receipts, the financial records, the paternity bomb, and the corporate termination letter Dominic had personally signed. We had built an inescapable trap for the most arrogant family in Atlanta. Julian had sent that toxic gold foil invitation, hoping to break my spirit and publicly assert his dominance. He wanted me to watch him claim a fake heir and a fraudulent bride. He wanted to use my pain as entertainment for his wealthy elite friends. He vastly underestimated the woman he tried to bury. I was fully prepared to walk into the St. Regis Hotel and burn his fake legacy to ashes. The trap was fully set. It was time to go to a wedding. The Astor Ballroom at the St. Regis Hotel was a masterclass in excessive wealth and carefully curated high society performance. It was $1 million spectacle designed specifically to intimidate anyone who stepped foot inside. The room was dripping in white orchids and imported gold accents. Towering crystal centerpieces stood on every single table, catching the light from the massive chandeliers overhead. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasted filet mignon, and the undeniable scent of old money. 300 of the most elite influential figures in Atlanta had gathered to witness the highly anticipated union of Julian and Valerie. Beatrice was in her absolute element. She was wearing a heavily beaded emerald green gown that looked more like a royal coronation outfit than a mother of the groom dress. She was gliding from table to table, holding a flute of premium vintage champagne, parading Valerie around the room like a prized breeding mare. Valerie was wearing a custom couture maternity wedding dress. The white silk was draped perfectly to emphasize her 9-month baby bump. She kept her hand resting delicately on her stomach, smiling a sweet fabricated smile as Beatrice introduced her to prominent judges, wealthy surgeons, and legacy business owners. "Look at this beautiful mother-to-be!" Beatrice announced, her voice projecting loudly over the elegant background music of a live jazz band. "She is carrying the next generation of our dynasty. The Sterling family heir is strong and thriving. We are so incredibly blessed that Julian found a woman of such high caliber and perfect health to secure our legacy." The wealthy guests murmured their approval, raising their glasses in a toast to the happy couple. They praised Beatrice's resilience, praising her for guiding her son through the supposedly traumatic breakup with me. They had all swallowed the lie completely. They looked at Valerie with absolute adoration, entirely blind to the grotesque deception sitting right in front of their faces. Julian was holding court near the grand marble bar at the far end of the ballroom. He was surrounded by his elite fraternity brothers and several senior partners from his wealth management firm. He held a glass of top-shelf bourbon, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. He looked incredibly smug. His chest was puffed out, his tailored tuxedo fitting him perfectly. How was basking in the glory of his fabricated masculinity. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had successfully discarded a broken woman and secured his position as the ultimate patriarch of the Sterling family. Standing just a few feet away, near a towering display of white roses, was his younger brother Andre. Andre was drinking heavily, his eyes tracking Valerie's every move across the ballroom. Every time Valerie glanced in Andre's direction, a silent, toxic communication passed between them. They were playing a highly dangerous game of high society roulette, entirely confident that Julian was too arrogant and blind to ever notice the truth. The entire ballroom was a magnificent house of cards built on a foundation of absolute lies. and I was standing right outside the heavy mahogany double doors holding the sledgehammer. Dominic and I stood in the plush, quiet corridor of the hotel. My heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic power. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety or fear. I felt like a highly trained soldier stepping onto a battlefield I had already conquered in my mind. The custom crimson red gown hugged my body perfectly. The heavy silk material flowed down to the floor, pooling around my stiletto heels. My massive twin baby bump was undeniable. It was a fierce, proud declaration of my health and my power. Dominic stood right beside me, an immovable fortress of strength. He wore a bespoke pitch-black tuxedo that made him look like a lethal apex predator. He adjusted his silver cufflinks and looked down at me, his dark eyes shining with intense anticipation. "Are you ready to burn their empire to the ground, Simone?" he asked, his voice a low, thrilling rumble. I smoothed my hands over the crimson silk, resting them briefly on my stomach. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I replied. Dominic nodded. He raised his hand and signaled to the two hotel staff members standing by the doors. They were not actually hotel staff. They were Dominic's highly trained private security operatives wearing the St. Regis uniform. The men grabbed the heavy brass handles of the grand double doors and pulled them open with a synchronized, forceful motion. The doors swung wide open, hitting the wall stops with a loud, resonant thud. Dominic offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his, and together we stepped directly into the brilliant light of the Astor Ballroom. Our entrance was explosive. The vibrant crimson red of my gown was a violent contrast to the sea of muted pastels and traditional black tuxedos filling the room. We stood at the top of the short marble staircase that led down into the main reception area, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the vicinity. The jazz band was in the middle of a lively, upbeat tempo. The band leader playing the saxophone happened to glance toward the doors. He saw the expression on Dominic's face and the sheer radiating power of my entrance. The band leader faltered, missing a note. The pianist stopped abruptly. Within 3 seconds, the music died completely, leaving the massive ballroom in a state of sudden, jarring silence. The sudden quiet caused the remaining guests to turn their heads toward the entrance. 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in Atlanta froze in their tracks. Gasps echoed across the opulent ballroom. It started as a low murmur and quickly escalated into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers. People physically took steps back, clearing a wide path for us, as Dominic and I slowly descended the marble stairs. I recognized the faces in the crowd. I saw the commercial real estate investors who had pulled their funding from my downtown project. I saw the wealthy socialites who had completely ignored me at charity luncheons. I saw the bankers who had blacklisted my company on Beatrice's orders. Their eyes were wide with sheer absolute terror. They were not just looking at the woman they had been told was barren and disgraced. They were looking at a woman who was heavily, undeniably pregnant. And more terrifyingly, they were looking at the man holding my arm. The financial executives in the room recognized Dominic Vance immediately. They knew exactly who he was, and they knew the lethal corporate power he wielded. The realization that the supposedly ruined middle-class developer was standing under the fierce protection of a private equity billionaire sent a shockwave of panic through the elite crowd. Across the room, Beatrice turned around to see what had caused the music to stop. The moment her eyes locked onto my crimson dress and my massive baby bump, the color completely drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. The crystal champagne flute in her hand began to shake violently. The expensive liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling directly down the front of her beaded emerald gown. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was entirely paralyzed by shock. Julian had been laughing with his fraternity brothers, but the sudden silence made him turn around. When he saw me walking down the center aisle of his $1 million wedding reception, his smug smile vanished. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage and panic. He thrust his bourbon glass into the chest of the banker standing next to him and marched aggressively across the dance floor. Valerie stayed back, her hands gripping the edge of the sweetheart table. Her carefully crafted bride persona cracked, revealing the terrified, scheming opportunist hiding underneath. Andre shifted nervously in the background, suddenly looking very eager to find an exit. Julian closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive tuxedo shirt. He looked at Dominic with a flash of hesitation, clearly intimidated by Dominic's imposing physical presence, but his arrogant ego quickly overrode his common sense. He needed to regain control of his narrative in front of his wealthy peers. He needed to prove he was the dominant force in the room. Julian puffed out his chest and looked me up and down. He let out a loud theatrical laugh designed to carry across the silent ballroom. He contorted his face into a mask of cruel mock pity. I honestly cannot believe the level of your desperation, Simone. Julian sneered, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Crashing my wedding just to beg for attention. And what exactly is this ridiculous performance? A fake bump. Did you actually stuff a pillow under your dress to pretend you are a complete woman? I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly still, letting his pathetic insults hang in the dead air of the ballroom. Julian took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he stared hard at the undeniable biological reality of my stomach. The realization that the bump was entirely real hit him. His face twitched, but he doubled down on his cruelty, raising his voice even louder for his mother and his investors to hear. Or did you actually manage to get knocked up? Julian shouted, pointing a hostile finger at my stomach. Did you go out and sleep with some random stranger from the street just to pretend your body is not completely useless? Are you trying to pass off some random bastard child as a victory just because you are bitter that I left your barren, broken self for a real woman? You are pathetic, Simone. You are a desperate, pathetic joke, and you are trespassing at my family legacy celebration. The guests around us held their collective breath. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to scream or slap him or run away in profound humiliation. They expected the fragile, broken woman Beatrice had described in her malicious gossip circles. Instead, I looked at Julian and smiled. It was a slow, cold, terrifying smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I did not say a single word to him. I did not need to defend my honor or explain the premium sperm bank donor that gave me my beautiful twins. I had something far more destructive planned for Julian than a simple verbal argument. I maintained my chilling smile, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his panicked face. I raised my right hand in the air and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound cut through the tense silence of the ballroom like a gunshot. At the exact moment my fingers snapped, the 4 catering staff members who were stationed near the grand double doors suddenly abandoned their serving trays. They moved with absolute military precision. They stepped directly in front of the heavy mahogany doors blocking the main exit entirely. They reached forward and pulled the massive brass deadbolts, shutting them firmly. A loud, unified, heavy click echoed through the silent ballroom. Dominic's private security team had just locked the doors from the inside. The realization rippled through the elite crowd like a physical shockwave. Julian turned his head, looking back at the locked doors and the large, muscular men guarding them. He looked back at me, his false bravado rapidly dissolving into genuine fear. Beatrice grabbed the edge of a guest table, her knuckles turning white. The wealthy bankers, the prominent judges, the socialite gossips, and the arrogant groom suddenly realized they were no longer guests at a luxury wedding reception. They were trapped in the locked room with an apex predator, and nobody was leaving until the execution was complete. I released Dominic's arm and stepped forward. The heavy silence of the ballroom amplified the sharp, confident click of my stilettos against the polished marble floor. I walked past the beautifully decorated guest tables, ignoring the wide, terrified eyes of the city's elite. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the absolute dread sink deep into the bones of the Sterling family. Julian tried to step in front of me to block my path, but Dominic was there in an instant. Dominic did not have to say a single word. He simply stepped between Julian and me, using his imposing broad shoulders to create an impenetrable physical barrier. Julian immediately backed down, shrinking away from Dominic's lethal glare. I bypassed the frantic groom and walked directly toward the lavishly decorated sweetheart table. Valerie was sitting there, clutching the edge of the silk tablecloth, her knuckles completely white. She looked like a trapped animal. I did not even spare her a glance. I walked right past her and stepped onto the raised platform where the jazz band was stationed. The musicians had frozen in place, unsure of what to do. I walked up to the lead singer and gently but firmly took the silver microphone right out of his trembling hand. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp percussive thumps echoed through the massive ballroom, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I stood at the edge of the stage, looking out over the sea of terrified high society faces. Then I locked my eyes directly onto Julian. He was standing near the dance floor, his chest heaving, his face a mask of panic and fury. Beatrice had marched up to stand right beside him, her emerald gown sparkling under the chandeliers. She looked ready to call the police, but she was completely paralyzed by the sheer, unprecedented audacity of my actions. "Julian," I said, my voice carrying perfectly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was smooth, cold, and completely devoid of any emotion. "You sent me a very specific invitation to this spectacular event. You told me you wanted to show me what a real, complete woman looks like. You invited me here to witness the beginning of your grand family legacy." I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, uncomfortable glances. They had been told I was a bitter, unstable ex-fiancé, but standing before them in my custom crimson gown, with a massive, healthy twin pregnancy, I looked like royalty holding court. "So, Julian," I continued, my voice dropping into a dangerous razor-sharp register, "let us talk about your legacy. Let us talk about the truth you and your mother have been so desperately hiding from every single person in this room." I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the thick, heavy medical file I had secured from Silas. I raised it high in the air for everyone to see. Then, with a swift, deliberate motion, I threw the file directly onto the center of the dance floor. It hit the polished wood with a loud, solid smack that made several guests. Right on cue, Dominic's trusted technology specialist, who was securely locked inside the hotel audiovisual booth, executed the next phase of the plan. The massive high-definition projector screens flanking the main stage suddenly flickered to life. These were the giant screens Julian and Valerie had rented to display their sickeningly sweet romantic slideshow during the dinner service. But there were no engagement photos or romantic beach shots on those screens tonight. Instead, stark white medical documents illuminated the dark ballroom in brilliant high definition. The letters were massive, impossible to ignore. The documents bore the official crest of the medical laboratory, and Julian's full legal name was printed clearly at the top of the page, along with his date of birth and patient identification number. The guests gasped, reading the giant text projected on the walls. Julian spun around, looking at the screens. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He staggered back a step, clutching his chest as if the projected words had physically struck him. I raised the microphone back to my lips. "For those in the back who might have trouble reading the small print, allow me to read the official medical diagnosis aloud," I announced. My voice was completely steady, echoing relentlessly across the grand space. "Julian Sterling. Diagnosis: total azoospermia. Irreversible and complete." I looked down at Julian, who was shaking his head in frantic denial. "You have been shooting blanks your entire life, Julian." I stated the brutal truth, crashing down on him in front of 300 elite witnesses. "Your sperm count is absolute zero. You are completely 100% genetically sterile. You will never biologically father a child. Your pristine high society bloodline ends permanently with you." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The polite silence of the elite crowd shattered instantly. Prominent judges, wealthy surgeons, and legacy business owners gasped, covering their mouths in pure shock. Whispers turned into loud, aggressive murmurs. People pointed at the massive screens and then pointed directly at Julian, the great patriarch of the Sterling family. The arrogant man who had discarded me for being a dead branch was standing in front of his entire social network, exposed as a completely sterile fraud. Julian began to scream. He waved his arms wildly at the screens, his voice cracking with hysteria. "It is a lie," he shouted, turning to the crowd. "She is lying. That document is a complete fabrication. She forged it because she is a jealous, bitter woman. Do not look at those screens. Turn them off." He looked desperately at Beatrice, seeking her protection like a frightened child. But Beatrice was staring at the screens with wide, terrified eyes. She knew the documents were real. She knew her ultimate secret was completely exposed. I smiled a dark, predatory smile. "I did not forge a single piece of paper, Julian," I said, my voice slicing right through his pathetic screaming. But speaking of fabrications, let us talk about how your mother managed to convince you that I was the broken one. Let us talk about how much it costs to buy a fake medical diagnosis in Buckhead. I snapped my fingers again, looking up at the audiovisual booth. The screens instantly shifted. The medical diagnosis vanished, replaced by a crisp, high-definition image of a bank statement. It was the offshore wire transfer receipt Silas had uncovered. The numbers were massive, bold, and highlighted in bright red. I kept the microphone close to my mouth, ensuring every single guest heard my next words perfectly, 2 days before Julian and I went to the clinic to receive my fertility results. Beatrice Sterling authorized a covert wire transfer from her private offshore trust fund. I explained methodically, breaking down her criminal actions for the entire room. She transferred exactly $150,000 to a shell corporation owned by the lead fertility doctor handling our case. The guests gasped again, the scandal deepening to unimaginable levels. I pointed directly at Beatrice, who was physically shaking, gripping the edge of a guest table to keep herself from collapsing. Beatrice knew her golden boy was sterile. I continued, projecting my voice over the rising din of the shocked crowd. She received the laboratory results early, and she could not handle the embarrassment. She could not stomach the idea of her elite friends finding out that her precious son was biologically flawed. So she paid a licensed medical professional $150,000 to swap our files. She paid him to look me in the eye and tell me my body was permanently broken. She framed me as a barren woman to protect Julian's fragile masculine pride, and to give him a socially acceptable excuse to dump me for a supposedly fertile heiress. The ballroom was practically shaking with the force of the scandal. The elite guests, the very people Beatrice had manipulated and controlled for decades, were staring at her with profound, absolute disgust. The matriarch of Atlanta society was standing before them exposed, not just as a liar, but as a ruthless criminal who had bribed a doctor to destroy an innocent woman's life. "Turn it off!" Beatrice shrieked, finally snapping out of her paralyzed state. Her voice was shrill and desperate, losing all of its polished high society elegance. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at the audiovisual booth. "Turn those screens off right now. Cut the power. I demand you cut the power immediately. Security. Someone get security up there." Several hotel staff members instinctively moved toward the stairs leading up to the balcony where the audiovisual booth was located. But they stopped dead in their tracks. Stepping out from the shadows of the balcony were four massive, highly trained security operatives employed directly by Dominic Vance. They wore dark suits and earpieces, and they moved with intimidating military precision. They crossed their arms and physically blocked the only entrance to the booth. They did not say a word, but their presence made it absolutely clear that nobody was getting past them. Dominic stood on the main floor watching his men with quiet approval. He had secured the perimeter perfectly. The screens were going to stay on until I was completely finished. Beatrice looked up at the blocked balcony, her face contorting in sheer, unadulterated panic. She turned to the crowd, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of credibility she had left. "Do not listen to her," Beatrice pleaded, holding her hands out to her wealthy friends. "It is a manipulation. She is trying to extort us. We are the Sterling family. You know us." But nobody was buying her lies anymore. The evidence projected on the massive screens was far too detailed, far too clinical, and entirely undeniable. The banking routing numbers matched her personal trust. The medical codes were legitimate. The high society guests began backing away from Beatrice and Julian, as if the mother and son duo were suddenly diseased. Women who had kissed Beatrice's cheek just 30 minutes ago were now whispering fiercely to their husbands, pointing at the wire transfer receipt with expressions of pure revulsion. Julian was hyperventilating, grabbing his hair in distress. He looked at the medical document showing his absolute sterility, and then he looked directly at Valerie. Valerie was sitting at the sweetheart table, her face completely drained of color. She was clutching her 9-month baby bump, her eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. Julian pointed a shaking finger at Valerie's stomach. His voice cracked, dropping into a devastating whisper that carried through the tense quiet of the ballroom. "But Valerie is pregnant. If I am completely sterile, Simone, if I cannot have children, then whose baby is she carrying?" The entire ballroom went dead silent. 300 guests held their breath, waiting for the final devastating blow. The trap had clamped shut completely, and the elite Sterling family was bleeding out on the polished marble floor of the St. Regis Hotel. Julian stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, his mind desperately rejecting the inescapable reality projected on the walls. He looked at the medical documents and then back at me, his breathing ragged and shallow. The illusion of his perfect masculinity was shattering in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta, and he could not handle the humiliation. He aggressively grabbed the microphone stand I had left on the stage, tearing it from its base. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at me. "You are lying!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "This is a complete and utter fabrication. You paid someone to hack the servers and create these fake documents because you are jealous. You are a bitter, barren woman trying to ruin the happiest day of my life." He turned wildly toward the horrified guests, waving his arms to command their attention. "Look at Valerie," he shouted, gesturing frantically toward the sweetheart table where his bride sat paralyzed with fear. "Look at her stomach. She is carrying my son. We conceived this child together. I am not sterile. I am a completely healthy man, passing down the Sterling family legacy. Do not believe a single word this crazy woman is saying." Julian marched over to Valerie and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. He dragged her out from behind the table, forcing her to stand in full view of the 300 elite guests. Valerie stumbled, her hands instinctively flying to her 9-month baby bump to protect herself from his erratic movements. She was crying now, silent, terrified tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. "Tell them," Julian demanded, shaking her arm. "Tell everyone in this room that you are carrying my child. Tell them about our legacy." Valerie opened her mouth, but she could not speak. She looked out at the sea of disgusted faces and then locked eyes with me. She knew the trap was inescapable. I smiled softly, picking up the microphone I had placed on the stage monitor. I let Julian's pathetic screams echo through the silent ballroom for a few more agonizing seconds before I delivered the final lethal blow. "If you are completely sterile, Julian," I asked, my voice cutting through his hysteria like a frozen blade whose baby is Valerie carrying. Julian froze. He dropped Valerie's arm and stared at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. The question hung in the heavy air of the Astor ballroom, wrapping around his neck like a tightening noose. He looked at Valerie, who had immediately covered her face with her trembling hands, and then he looked back at me. "What are you talking about?" Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heavy breathing. I did not answer him directly. I did not need to. I simply raised my hand and signaled the audiovisual booth one final time. The massive high-definition projector screens flickered again. The stark white medical documents and wire transfer receipts vanished entirely. The ballroom was plunged into temporary darkness before a new crisp image illuminated the massive walls. It was not a document this time. It was a high-definition security video. The footage was stamped with a clear, glowing timestamp in the bottom right corner, proving the exact date and time of the recording. The camera angle provided a wide, sweeping view of a very familiar, highly exclusive corporate workspace. The guests immediately recognized the location. It was the lavish corner executive suite of the very wealth management firm where Julian served as vice president. The same firm Dominic Vance had just secretly acquired. The heavy mahogany desk, the custom leather chairs, and the expansive view of the Atlanta skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows were absolutely unmistakable. On the massive screens, the heavy oak door of the executive office swung open. A woman walked into the frame, her face illuminated perfectly by the ambient city lights spilling through the windows. It was Valerie. She was wearing a tight designer dress, her fake early pregnancy bump barely visible. Julian stared at the screens, his mouth hanging open in utter confusion. He recognized his own office, but he clearly had no memory of this specific night. Then a second figure stepped out of the shadows near the private adjoining bathroom. He was a tall man walking with a lazy, confident swagger. As he stepped into the light, his face became crystal clear on the massive 40-foot screens flanking the ballroom stage. It was Andre, Julian's younger 30-year-old brother, the lazy, spoiled black sheep of the Sterling family. A collective gasp of absolute horror ripped through the ballroom. 300 high society guests watched in paralyzed silence as the ultimate betrayal played out right in front of their eyes. On the screen, Andre grabbed Valerie by the waist, pulling her aggressively against his chest. Valerie laughed, throwing her arms around Andre's neck and kissing him with a frantic, desperate hunger. There was no hesitation between them. There was no guilt or remorse. They moved with the comfortable, familiar rhythm of two people who had been conducting a passionate, illicit affair for a very long time. Julian watched his own brother lift his beautiful bride onto his immaculate mahogany executive desk. He watched them sweep his important corporate files and framed family photographs onto the floor, shattering the glass without a single second of hesitation. He watched the two of them engage in a passionate, highly explicit encounter right in the center of his professional sanctuary. The high-definition resolution spared absolutely no details. The footage was crisp, undeniable, and profoundly devastating. Every single guest in the St. Regis ballroom was forced to witness the exact moment the fake Sterling family heir was conceived. I kept the microphone close to my lips, ensuring my voice projected perfectly over the heavy silence of the room. "The legacy heir your mother is so incredibly proud of, Julian," I announced, methodically delivering the absolute truth, "is actually the product of your jobless younger brother and your deceitful future wife. They have been having an affair on your desk for months. You were never building a legacy. You were just providing a wealthy, convenient cover story for their absolute betrayal." The implosion of the Sterling family was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaotic madness. The refined, polite veneer of the Atlanta elite was completely obliterated. Prominent judges covered their eyes in disgust. Wealthy surgeons grabbed their wives' arms, pulling them away from the stage as if the entire wedding party was toxic. The prestigious alumni networks and country club members began shouting over each other, the scandal completely shattering their rigid social composure. Julian stood completely paralyzed, staring at the frozen frame of his brother and his bride locked together on the massive screens. His hands balled into tight, shaking fists at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive, tailored tuxedo collar. He slowly turned his head away from the screens and looked directly across the dance floor. Andre was standing near the towering display of white roses. His face was completely drained of color. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He took a slow, terrified step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked double doors of the ballroom. Julian let out a guttural, agonizing roar that sounded more animal than human. The sound ripped through the chaotic noise of the ballroom, silencing the closest guests. Julian did not say a single word. He lowered his head and charged. Andre panicked. He turned and tried to sprint toward the catering exit, but his expensive leather dress shoes slipped on the polished marble floor. He lost his footing for a critical fraction of a second, and that was all Julian needed. Julian tackled his younger brother with the full explosive force of his humiliation and rage. The impact lifted Andre completely off his feet. The two brothers crashed violently through the air, landing directly on top of the massive 5-tier custom wedding cake. The collision was spectacular. Wood splintered and glass shattered as the decorative table collapsed under their combined weight. Thousands of dollars worth of vanilla fondant, buttercream frosting, and intricate sugar flowers exploded across the dance floor, covering their expensive tuxedos in a grotesque, sticky mess. Julian pinned Andre to the ruined floor, raining down furious, uncoordinated punches while screaming violently about betrayal and legacy. Valerie fell to her knees, clutching her massive 9-month pregnant stomach. She burst into loud, hysterical tears, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched the two brothers tear each other apart over her deception. Her carefully crafted facade of the perfect, wealthy heiress was completely shattered, leaving her exposed as a desperate, manipulative fraud. She screamed for Julian to stop crying out, that it was a mistake, that she loved him. But her words were completely drowned out by the chaos of the brawl. Dominic's security team moved in quickly, but they did not intervene immediately. They simply formed a tight, protective perimeter around Dominic and me, ensuring the violence stayed safely contained near the ruined cake display. I stood perfectly still, leaning comfortably against Dominic's solid side, watching the spectacular destruction of the men who had tried to destroy me. Across the room, Beatrice Sterling was experiencing the total systematic annihilation of her entire world. The formidable matriarch of the Atlanta Black elite, the woman who had ruled charity boards and high society galas with an iron fist, was completely broken. Beatrice stumbled backward, her hands frantically clutching the beaded bodice of her emerald green gown. She looked at the giant projector screens showing her youngest son defiling her eldest son's office. She looked at the shattered wedding cake where her two boys were violently beating each other in front of the city's most influential citizens. She looked at the weeping pregnant bride who had made a complete mockery of her precious bloodline. And finally she looked directly at me. I offered her a slow, chilling smile, raising my chin in absolute victory. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, wheezing gasp. Her face turned a dangerous shade of purple. She clutched her chest tightly, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the expensive silk of her dress. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed heavily into a nearby gold Chiavari chair. She gasped for air, her eyes rolling back slightly as a severe panic attack seized her entire body. She reached out a trembling hand toward the wealthy women she had called her closest friends. She silently begged the prominent socialites for help, for comfort, for a shield against the suffocating humiliation. But the elite women of Atlanta simply turned their backs on her. They gathered their expensive silk wraps and designer clutch purses, looking down at Beatrice with expressions of profound, absolute disgust. Nobody stepped forward to help her. Nobody offered her a glass of water or a kind word of support. In a society that valued image and pristine reputation above all else, Beatrice had committed the ultimate unforgivable sin. She had been publicly exposed as a liar, a fraud, and a criminal. She was entirely stripped of her pristine reputation right in front of the very society she had so ruthlessly ruled. Her legacy was no longer one of wealth and power. It was a legacy of profound, pathetic humiliation. The ballroom itself looked like the scene of a tragic theatrical play. The beautiful white orchids that had cost thousands of dollars were now trampled under the feet of fleeing guests. The expensive crystal centerpieces lay shattered across the expensive linen tablecloths. The live jazz band had packed up their instruments, completely abandoning the stage in the wake of the explosive scandal. The pristine, flawless image that Beatrice had meticulously crafted for this million-dollar reception was reduced to a spectacular, sticky mess of ruined fondant and shattered glass. I looked up at Dominic, who was watching the scene with a calm, appreciative expression. He gently placed his hand over mine, resting it softly against my massive, crimson-clad baby bump. Our twins were safely shielded from the chaos, surrounded by absolute power and protection. Julian, finally exhausted from his blind rage, was pulled off his brother by the hotel management's security staff. He stood up, wiping a mixture of blood and vanilla frosting from his bruised face. He looked around the emptying ballroom, seeing the disgusted faces of his former mentors and investors. He looked at his mother, slumped in a chair, gasping for breath, while her former friends ignored her pleas for assistance. He looked at the weeping woman on the floor, holding a belly that carried his brother's child. He had lost everything in the span of 15 minutes. His pride, his legacy, his family, and his reputation were completely eradicated. But the execution was not quite over. The final blow, the total corporate annihilation, had yet to be delivered. I turned my head and gave Dominic a subtle nod. It was time for the billionaire titan to officially claim his kingdom and finish the job. Julian shook off the security guards holding his arms. His tailored tuxedo was completely ruined, covered in blood, sweat, and vanilla buttercream. He glared across the wrecked dance floor at Dominic and me. His chest heaved with exertion, but his arrogance refused to die. He pointed a sticky, shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you have won!" Simone Julian screamed, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You think a few fake medical records and a security video can destroy me. I am the vice president of the most elite wealth management fund in Atlanta. I control hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate assets. I will use every single ounce of my executive power to bankrupt your pathetic real estate company. I will crush your commercial developments into dust. And I will make sure this bodyguard of yours loses everything he owns. You are dead in this city. I will completely destroy you both." I did not flinch at his pathetic threats. I just smiled and stepped slightly to the side, allowing Dominic to take center stage. Dominic moved forward with the slow, deliberate grace of a lion closing in on its wounded prey. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to command absolute authority. His mere presence seemed to drain the remaining oxygen from the grand ballroom. He walked right up to Julian, stopping just inches away from his frosting-covered face. Julian took a frightened step backward, instinctively recognizing the overwhelming gap in their power. Dominic reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke black tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing a very familiar corporate seal. He held it out, extending it toward Julian's chest. "You are not going to destroy anyone," Julian Dominic said, his deep baritone voice carrying perfectly through the quiet room. "And you no longer possess any executive power. My private equity firm finalized the hostile acquisition of your wealth management group at exactly 9 o'clock yesterday morning. I am the new majority shareholder. I am the chairman of the board, and I am officially your boss." Julian stared at the white envelope, his jaw dropping in absolute terror. He looked from the corporate seal up to Dominic's cold, unyielding eyes. Dominic pressed the envelope firmly against Julian's ruined tuxedo shirt, forcing him to take it. "That is your formal letter of termination," Dominic stated, the brutal truth hitting the room like a physical shockwave. "You are fired, Julian. Effectively immediately." Julian shook his head frantically, his fingers fumbling with the thick paper. "You cannot fire me," he stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic whine. "I am a legacy partner. My family built that firm." "Your family ran that firm into the ground," Dominic corrected sharply. "And you made the ultimate fatal error. During my team's due diligence audit, we uncovered massive financial discrepancies in your private executive accounts. You utilized millions of dollars in restricted company funds to pay for this ridiculous $1 million wedding spectacle. You embezzled corporate capital to finance a fraudulent marriage. My legal team has already forwarded the financial evidence to the federal authorities. You are not just fired, Julian. You are going to federal prison." The final nail was driven perfectly into the coffin. Julian dropped the termination letter. The crisp white paper fluttered to the ruined dance floor, landing in a puddle of spilled champagne and crushed white orchids. His legs gave out completely, and he fell to his knees in the center of the wreckage. He had no job. He had no legacy. He had no biological future. He was facing devastating criminal charges, and he was entirely humiliated by his own brother and his deceitful bride. Around the ballroom, the remaining elite guests made their final judgments. The exodus was swift and merciless. Nobody wanted to be associated with a sterile, unemployed embezzler and a disgraced matriarch. Wealthy bankers and prominent judges turned their backs, grabbing their coats and rushing toward the exit. They stepped over the ruined wedding cake, avoiding Julian as if he were a physical plague. Beatrice watched her entire social empire crumble to ash. She remained slumped in her gold chair, clutching her chest, as her lifelong friends walked right past her without a single glance of sympathy. The high society she had ruled with an iron fist had completely exiled her. Valerie, seeing that the billionaire golden boy was now a penniless criminal, scrambled to her feet. She held her fake designer gown up away from the sticky floor and ran out the service doors, crying hysterically into her hands. Andre had already vanished into the night, leaving his brother to face the absolute ruin alone. Dominic turned away from the pathetic scene and offered me his arm. I took it, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. We walked out of the St. Regis Hotel through the grand front doors, leaving the toxic Sterling family to rot in the spectacular mess they had created. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air filled my sprawling backyard in the Buckhead suburbs. I was sitting on a plush outdoor sofa watching the orange leaves fall gently onto the pristine green lawn. I looked down at my arms, cradling my 2 perfectly healthy, beautiful baby boys. They were thriving, growing stronger every single day, surrounded by absolute peace and security. Dominic walked out onto the patio carrying 2 mugs of warm tea. He smiled down at me, his eyes filled with overwhelming love and fierce devotion. He leaned down and kissed my forehead before gently kissing the top of each baby's head. He was the perfect father, the perfect partner, and the ultimate chosen family I had always deserved. The news in Atlanta had been relentless over the past few months. Julian had been indicted on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement and fraud. His highly publicized trial was scheduled for the winter, and legal experts predicted he would face at least a decade behind bars. Dominic's firm had systematically dismantled Julian's old company, selling off the assets for a massive profit. Beatrice was forced to sell her lavish estate to cover her son's mounting legal fees. She was completely expelled from every charity board and country club in the state, living out her days in bitter, isolated obscurity. Valerie and Andre had turned on each other, suing one another for child support neither of them could afford. I sat back taking a slow sip of my tea while my son slept peacefully against my chest. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life. The greatest revenge is never shouting matching cruelty with cruelty or begging for validation from toxic people. The ultimate revenge is simply gathering your evidence, securing your boundaries, and letting the wicked completely destroy themselves. You walk away with your head held high, focus on building your own beautiful empire, and watch from the very top as their house of cards collapses into dust. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation and let karma do the heavy lifting? Have you ever used your own massive success as the ultimate response to the people who tried to break you? Let me know your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey of absolute justice and rising from the ashes, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of powerful comebacks. Never let anyone convince you that you are a dead branch, because you always hold the power to plant your own forest. Thank you for watching, and always remember, your worth is defined strictly by you.